Good morning. Thanks for being punctual in your chairs. That's great. This is our, it's something about a joint session, but it's got nothing to do with our recent marijuana laws, so watch yourselves. This actually is kind of the meaty part of the meeting where we get the recommendations and comments from the advisory bodies. So we will hear sequentially from the conference board, the process advisory group, and the management system advisory board. So without further delay, let's start and receive the conference board report.
Good morning, Commissioners. Linda Benkin with Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association.
Jim Lane with Juneau Tribal Council, Canada.
We're the co-chairs this year of the conference board. I won't read through the list of all the people on the board. It's a great and large group. The names actually overflow onto the second page just so you see where everybody is. I'll start on page 2 then of going through our written report. The United States section accredited 49 organizations for participation in the 2016 conference board proceedings, and Canada section accredited 29 organizations. We welcome 2 new member groups this year. The United States selected me as co-chair for the U.S. side, and Canada selected Jim Lane. We did our best to stumble through the agenda with everybody. For opening dates, the conference board recommends an opening date of March 3rd, 2016 and a closing date of November 7th. The following are comments from the Canadian U.S. delegates regarding the season dates. U.S., particularly the Alaska representatives, indicated strong support for as long a season as possible to maximize fresh market opportunities, distribute effort, take advantage of favorable tides in Alaska, and minimize interactions with sperm whales. Alaska representatives explained that a late season opening creates a derby as longliners who also salmon fish race to catch their quota before the salmon season. Canada favored an opening date of March 19th to coincide with favorable tides, but voted in favor of the March 3rd date. Area 2A fishermen favored a later opening date to take advantage of favorable tides in their areas. Representatives of Western Alaska supported a late closure date to allow the sablefish season to extend until mid-November, but the conference board recognized the late year data constraints faced by staff. That motion was adopted on the U.S. side, 28 in favor, 11 opposed, 2 abstentions, and in Canada, unanimously in favor. Season date recommendations for 2A. The conference board supports the staff recommendations for the 7 Area 2A commercial openings that are on page 24 in your Blue Book. Beginning on June 24th is outlined in the Blue Book, page 203. There was a mistake in your Blue Book on a couple of those dates. We talked to the 2A managers and got those straightened out, so I think the dates that you see here are the correct ones. For the Area 2A directed commercial fishery, the staff recommends an opening pattern similar to 2015, starting the last week of June with a series of 10-hour periods with fishing period limits. We recommend the following series for 2016, June 22nd, July 6th, July 20th, August 3rd, August 17th, August 31st, September 14th, and September 28th. The size of the fishing period limits will be determined when more information is available on fleet participation. On the capturing plans, the conference board adopted the IPHC recommendations to endorse the CSP developed by the Pacific Fishery Management Council that's on page 187 of the Blue Book. For Area 4C D&E, the conference board adopted the capture plans for Area 4C D&E per 187 in your Blue Book. We had a statement that we've heard a number of years in a row that Canada, the Canadian members of the conference board consider the 2B capturing plan to be a domestic allocation issue, and therefore we did not address it as a conference board. For the Area 2C and 3A catch sharing plans, these do take action by the Commission to implement. The Conference Board did take these up. The Conference Board endorsed the halibut charter management measures developed by the Charter Stakeholder Committee and recommended by the North Pacific Council. These are also on 187. For Area 2C charters, 1 fish daily bag limit with a reverse slot limit allowing the retention of 1 fish less than or equal to 40 inches or greater than or equal to 80 inches in length with head-on. And then the note that if the final charter allocation is sufficiently higher than the blue line to accommodate a change in the reverse slot limit, the Council recommends adjusting the size of the lower limit upward to meet the allocation. Area 3A charter 2 fish daily bag limit, 1 fish of any size, and a maximum size on the second fish of 28 inches with head-on. There's an annual limit of 4 fish. In addition, each charter halibut permit is limited to 1 charter halibut fishing trip per vessel per calendar day. Charter halibut fishing will be prohibited on Wednesday for the entire sport fishing season. Additionally, the NPFMC is recommending including for the Area 3A charter fishery a requirement to record halibut information on the back of the license or harvest card as an enforcement mechanism for the annual limit. If an annual limit is required for Area 2, a similar provision will apply in that area. And you can find recommendations for adjusting the harvest management measures in the Area 3A if the Area 3A catch limit is above the blue line on page 188 of the Blue Book. The paragraph below is actually a carryover from that page in the Blue Book. It was not part of the motion, and I'll correct that when we finalize these. And this motion passed unanimously in U.S. and Canada. We had another motion on charter halibut management at the Conference Board. The motion is the Conference Board recommends that the IPHC notify the Council that they should provide the Commission with recommendations on how to adjust the harvest management measures if final catch limits are above or below the blue line to avoid IPHC adjustments to these domestic harvest measures. The discussion on that, the Conference Board noted that the Council did not provide recommendations relative to adjusting the management measures downward in 3A, and final bycatch numbers for 3A reduced the 3A blue line subsequent to the NPFMC meeting. Since bycatch numbers are often finalized late in the year, this blue line change could occur with some regularity. Area 3A charter representatives and Charter Stakeholder Committee Chair expressed support for this motion as well. This motion passed unanimously. Canada, on the U.S., Canada abstained as they felt this was a domestic issue. On catch limits, the Conference Board adopted the following catch limits for 2016. For Area 2A, 1.33 million pounds. For 2B, 7.35 million pounds. That motion was adopted by the U.S., by Canada, failed on the U.S. side. For 2C, 5.64 million pounds. For 3A, 10.10 million pounds, adopted by the U.S., failed Canada. 3B, 3 million pounds, also adopted by the U.S. and failed Canada. 4A, 1.39 million pounds. 4B, 1.3 million pounds. 4C, D, and E, 1.64 million pounds, for a total of 31.75 million pounds. So I'll read through the rationale for each area. We spent a fair bit on catch limits, a lot of discussion in each area about status of stocks, and we did our best to capture the high points of that. Area 2A, the 1.33 million pound catch limit, proponents of the motion stated the following: the weight per unit effort has increased in both the survey and the commercial fishery. The fishing in 2014 was thought to be the best most fishermen had ever seen. 2015 fishing season was significantly better than 2014. Area 2A has a long history of good management that has prevented sector overages despite a high number of user groups, short openings, and small catch limit numbers. Bycatch in Area 2A trawl fisheries has been reduced by 450,000 pounds, which is a 77% reduction. Proponents believe the stock can support this 310,000 pound increase over the blue line, and then this level will allow fishermen to fully prosecute the Area 2A fisheries and reduce wastage. This motion passed in the U.S. Section 3163. Canada supported unanimously. For Area 2B, Canadian Conference Board members adopted a 7.35 million pound combined commercial and recreational catch limit. Canada notes that recent long-term average level of coastwide removals from the stock is close to 60 million pounds. The current level of removals is 40 million pounds. The ratio of the current Canadian removals to around 40 million pounds of total removals is consistent with the ratio of Canada's long-term removals to the total removals. Canada notes it considers the reference point for removals in 2B to be their recent removals, as these have shown to be sustainable for Area 2B, as indicated by the survey and commercial fishery indices that are stable and increasing respectively. Canada points out its management of directed and bycatch fisheries have had 100% at-sea and dockside monitoring in all hook and line, trap, groundfish fisheries since 2006. All directed and non-directed commercial harvest in these fisheries is quota applicable and comes from the commercial TAC. U.S. members that did not support the 2B catch limit believe the harvest in Area 2B over the past few years have been too high and have negatively affected recovery of stocks in Area 2C and 2A. There are also strong concerns that the harvest rates adopted in Area 2 in recent years have not been the same across all Area 2 regulatory areas, with the harvest rates in 2B being significantly higher. U.S. Conference Board members want to see a common harvest rate applied to all of Area 2 and send a strong message to this effect to the commissioners. Area 2B, Canadian members disagreed strongly with the notion of a unified harvest rate being applied to all of Area 2, stating that the areas are different and have different management processes and hence different stock dynamics. This motion failed on the U.S. Section 1421.5 and was supported unanimously by Canada. Area 2C, we had two motions. I'll read you first the motion that passed, and then for background, we've included the motion that was actually made first but failed. So the catch limit that was approved by the Conference Board is 5.64 million pounds, a combined commercial and guided sport catch limit. Proponents noted that dramatic catch limit reductions have worked to rebuild stocks. Area 2C has the strongest weight per unit effort, large fish, lowest bycatch, no trawling allowed in the area, strong indicators of high productivity. The weight per unit effort has increased relative to last year in both the survey and the commercial fishery. Other proponents noted that conservation in Area 2C has benefited areas 2A and 2B and that the harvest rate should be consistent across all Area 2. Area 2C charter representatives also spoke in favor of the 5.64 million pound catch limit. Area 2B representatives agreed Area 2C catch indices warrant reasonable increases for 2C, but did not support applying a constant harvest rate across all of Area 2. Some Conference Board members considered 5.64 million pounds to be too low for Area 2C, given the clear signs of strong stocks and the stability of 2B stocks despite consistently high harvest rates over the past 6 years. There was also support for setting the Area 2C catch limit at the blue line from some Conference Board members. This motion passed the U.S. 27 yes, 9 opposed, 4 abstentions. Canada at 25 yes, 2 opposed, and 2 abstentions. So again, the first motion that was made for 2C that failed would have set the catch limit in 2C at 6.44 million pounds. Some Area 2C representatives supported a higher catch limit, noting that Area 2B stocks have remained stable or increasing with a harvest rate of 29% and higher, and that Area 2C stocks have been underharvested. Proponents of the higher 2C catch limit noted 6.44 was 75% of historic catch limits, that tagging studies indicate very little outmigration from Area 2C, and that all of Area 2 should have the same harvest rate. And again, Canadian representatives objected to comments that the harvest rate should be the same across Area 2, but some supported the higher catch limit recommendation based on strong abundance indices in Area 2C. This motion failed the U.S. 1521-4, but passed Canada unanimously. Moving on to Area 3A. The Conference Board adopted a 10.10 million pound combined commercial and guided sport catch limit, which is the same as the 2015 adopted catch limit. Conference Board members noted that the commercial catch indices show an increase from 2015, but the survey catch indices remain low and stable. Proponents noted that the survey weight per unit effort from the Yakutat area increased significantly. You can find this from 2015, and you can find that information on page 519 of the RARA. and stated their expectation that the stock would continue to recover from east to west. Opponents stated that the bycatch has increased in 3A, that guided sport removals exceeded allocation, that the accuracy in accounting for bycatch was uncertain, and that therefore the catch limit should be conservative and set at the blue line. This motion for the 10 million pound catch limit passed the U.S. Section 21.819 and failed on in Canada at 2, 7, and 16. For Area 2B, the Conference Board adopted a 3 million pound catch limit. Proponents of the Area 3B recommendation pointed out the survey catch indices show an apparent increasing trend, and the commercial catch indices increased notably relative to 2015. Some fishermen stated fishing in parts of 3B was very good and that they're seeing a lot of halibut in areas under 20 fathoms in depths that are currently not surveyed. They also noted that catch limits have been reduced by 87% over the past few years, that this reduction has contributed to stock building, and that therefore a small increase from 2015 is justified. Some members of the U.S. side did not support the motion, stating that the survey and catch data does not provide enough evidence to warrant an increase for 2016. Also, that there's great uncertainty with bycatch removals, and that fishing has improved but is still not as good as what it used to be. This motion passed in the U.S. side 28-6-5, and in Canada it was opposed at 17-2-9. That doesn't look right. Did we get that one? Somehow that vote doesn't look right because that would have passed at 17-2-9. We'll have to check the minutes on that one. Area 4A, the Conference Board adopted a 1.39 million pound catch limit. Proponents of this catch limit considered the 4A resource to be stabilized or increasing. The commercial weight per unit effort increased 9% relative to 2014, and although the survey weight per unit effort is down, proponents stated the survey misses the high abundance area, so underestimates the stock. Proponents characterized the stock in 1995 as unexploited, hence the rapid drop in weight per unit effort between 95 and 205. Components stated that their concern was that a catch limit above the blue line could cause abundance to decline. This motion passed on the U.S. side 28 in support, 6 opposed, 5 abstentions, and Canada supported unanimously. Area 4B, the F supported a catch limit of 1.3 million pounds. Proponents stated that the Area 4B biomass estimate, commercial weight per unit effort, and survey weight per unit effort have all increased relative to 2015. They stated 4B was an unexploited stock in 95 with fishing has dropped to stable and now slightly increasing levels. Proponents stated the Aleutian Islands are a discrete ecosystem and that the halibut stock in the Aleutian shows little, if any, migratory contribution to other areas as reflected by genetics and oceanographic currents. There's references for some of these statements as well as tagging studies. They maintain that the Area 4B stock can support a harvest rate of 21.5%, which is the basis of this FCY, as applied to the 4B exploitable biomass of 7.08 million pounds, which yields and gave you the calculations of how they ended up at that point, and a citation for that. Opponents were concerned that the weight per unit effort is well below historic levels, that 4B stocks could not withstand this harvest rate, and that a FCEY of this level will reverse the current stock recovery. This motion passed in the U.S. 24 yes, 8 no, and 7 abstentions, and on the Canadian side the vote was 2 yes and 27 abstentions. No no's. Area 4C, D, and E, the Conference Board adopted 1.64 million pound catch limit, which is the blue line for this area. Proponents noted that the expanded survey in 4C, D, and E reduces uncertainty and resulted in higher stock indices. Voluntary bycatch reductions also contributed to a higher FCEY in this area. Proponents noted that the high dependency of Area 4C, D, and E residents on the halibut fishery, as well as the cultural, social, and economic importance of the directed halibut fishery to Area 4C, D, and E communities. And that motion passed unanimously, both sides. So we had some comments when we got to the end of action on the total, and we came back. We had a table from Ian that laid out what our motion meant in terms of removals in all categories. And these are the comments relative to that. Proponents of our total catch limit motion believe that the Conference Board catch limit recommendations respond to staff indication of a total FCUY that maintains the fishing intensity, or SPR, at a level close to 2015. Given the overall more favorable stock condition, proponents believe this total FCUY reflects a conservative and risk-adverse approach. Spawning biomass and eBio both are stable or increasing, and the declining size at age is leveled off. That said, Conference Board members noted that catch limit recommendations were made based on an evaluation of Conference Board members of abundance in each area rather than in any attempt to remain at or below a certain total FCUY. One Conference Board representative expressed concern that the 2015 SPR and 2016 recommendation could represent an F30 harvest rate given the confidence interval range around the estimate that the harvest levels recommended by the Conference Board translated into a 1 in 3 chance of stock decline instead of the 50-50 at the blue line, and that too great a risk was being taken with the future of the stock. Finally, some Conference Board members stated their dissatisfaction with applying different harvest rates across Area 2, while others restated their view that different harvest rates in Area 2 were appropriate. Okay, then we had a motion, again relative to catch limits, that it was the intent of the Conference Board that no area be penalized or lose quota relative to the Conference Board recommendations to benefit another area. Proponents of the motion believed that the Commissioners set the total FCUY lower than the total recommended by the Conference Board. Reductions to catch limits should be made proportionally across areas except for CD&E, which is at the blue line. The alternative perspective is the Commissioners should exercise their judgment in deciding where reductions should be made if the total FCUY was determined to be too high. That motion passed the U.S. 18 yes, 9 no, 10 abstentions, and failed in Canada 1 yes, 27 no, and 1 abstention. We then had a motion for your future work on harvest policy. The Conference Board recommends that Commissioners prioritize the task of reviewing and updating the harvest policy and harvest control rules. The Conference Board asks Commissioners to direct staff to work with a Science Review Board to develop harvest policy control rule options to be reviewed and evaluated by the MSAB. This is a priority of the U.S. and Canadian stakeholders who request the assignment of sufficient staff and resources to accomplish this in a timely manner of 1 to 2 years. The rationale discussion there, the staff has indicated that the harvest policy needs to be reviewed to determine whether existing harvest control rules and blue line harvest rates are appropriate. The Conference Board believes that the management process would benefit from development of an updated harvest policy that is better aligned with recent catch limit decisions from the Commission, and believes the evaluation of IPHC harvest policy options by the MSAB should be a Commission priority. And that motion passed unanimously. We next had a motion on bycatch. The Conference Board appreciates the work that IPHC staff have done to provide a greater understanding of the impacts associated with halibut bycatch and the need for bycatch reduction measures. We strongly recommend that the IPHC continue with this work and advocate for additional reductions in halibut bycatch in the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Gulf of Alaska. The Conference Board also supports continued work with the Council to develop abundance-based PSC management approaches that protect the reproductive value of the halibut stock and maintain and improve traditional directive fisheries in the U.S. and Canada. Priorities are: 1, continued improvement in the management of all bycatch fisheries, particularly in the Gulf of Alaska; 2, increased observer coverage of the trawl fishery in the Gulf; and 3, abundance-based PSC management with a cap in accordance with National Standard 9 of MSA. That motion passed unanimously. We next moved into the industry regulatory proposals. The first was the proposal to lower the minimum size limit to 30 inches. There was a motion to reduce that size limit from 32 to 30 inches in areas 3A, 3B, 4A, 4B, and 4C, D, and E, but to continue to apportion between areas using current exploitable biomass policy. In other words, that lowering the minimum size should not change apportionment between regulatory areas. The motion also included to reassess the minimum size if size at age changes in the future. The rationale: proponents of the proposal stated that reducing the size limit would significantly reduce wastage as the number of small halibut in areas 3 and 4 is considerable. Proponents noted the concerns of the IPHC staff regarding the potential change in selectivity that may occur, but stated their belief that the lower price paid for small fish would deter changes in fishing behavior or selectivity. Proponents stated that the lower size would increase harvest of males and therefore reduce the harvest of females, which should provide additional benefits to the overall stock. Finally, proponents stated that the minimum size was increased from 26 to 32 inches when processors could not market small frozen halibut, and that this is less of a consideration given the larger fresh fish market. Those that did not support the proposal were concerned changes in selectivity would not be known due to the lack of adequate monitoring and believed concerns raised by staff have not yet been addressed. Others were concerned that changing the size limit this time without proper monitoring would lead to increased mortality of small juvenile fish and higher release mortality of fish smaller than 30 inches. The general consensus of those opposed was that there were too many uncertainties associated with the proposal and further refinement is needed. This motion passed the U.S. section 14 yes, 11 no, 13 abstentions. In Canada, 3 yes, 18 no, and 6 abstentions. So failed on the Canadian side and passed on the U.S. side. On IPHC staff regulatory proposals, retention of tagged halibut, the conference board unanimously approved a motion to extend regulations that allow retention of tagged halibut at any time on any vessel to include the sport, guided sport, and personal use fisheries. Log regulations for the Alaska commercial fishery, the U.S. members of the conference board unanimously approved the recommendation to allow the NMFS electronic logbook to be added to the list of IPHC acceptable logbooks. Canadian conference board members abstained as they view this as a domestic management issue. U.S. conference board members noted that this logbook was developed in consultation with the IPHC and the fishing industry and has industry support. And government agency proposals, I think we already went through the catch sharing plans, those are above. We did take up the issue to allow longline pot gear as a legal commercial halibut gear in the Gulf of Alaska. We had a motion to allow legal size halibut to be retained in sablefish pots by fishermen with unfished IFQ for that area without retention limits for 3 years or until an appropriate maximum bycatch rate is determined. Conference members in support of this motion stated that allowing retention made sense and reduced waste. Also, that existing data was insufficient to establish an appropriate maximum retainable amount at this time, but that one should be established if necessary to prevent targeting halibut with pots. Opponents noted that the council regulations to allow pots do not specify the type or size of pot. Therefore, large pots could be used to target halibut, which would cause gear conflicts, gear loss, and impacts to small boats that currently fish halibut with long lines. That motion passed U.S. 18 yes, 15 no, and 5 no, and 15 abstentions. Canada abstained as they considered this a domestic management issue. On the industry regulatory proposals, there's a proposal to amend the IPHC fish ticket reporting requirements for Area 2A tribes. The conference board was advised that no action by the commission was necessary, so we took no action on this proposal. Revised commercial logbook requirement. The conference board also took no action on this proposal. The request to change the regulation relating to IPHC logbook requirements were submitted due to concerns about enforcement actions on vessels targeting blackcod and not encountering or retaining halibut. After reviewing logbook enforcement actions over the past year, it became apparent that enforcement priorities are appropriately focused on vessels retaining halibut and not filling out an IPHC logbook, so no action appears necessary at this time. Establish a maximum size limit of 60 inches in both the commercial and sport fisheries. The conference board reviewed this proposal and took no action after noting staff comments relative to the minimum benefits to the spawning stock of releasing fish over 60 inches and the risk of injury to the fish and crew of measuring and releasing large halibut. Discard mortality rate motion. The conference board recommends the commissioners direct staff to re-examine the appropriateness of the 16% discard mortality rate currently assigned to halibut released in the U.S. and Canadian directed halibut fisheries. This was a motion brought before the conference board that we've talked about in past years, but we took up at this time. Proponents believe the actual discard mortality rate on halibut released in the directed fishery is lower than 16%, and noted the Pacific cod freezer longline fleet, which hauls gear much faster, has a 10% DMR. The Proponent shared information on the increased revenue that would accrue to the directed fishery if discard mortality rates were reduced, and others noted that the current DMR was not well explained or documented and would benefit from review. This motion passed unanimously. Another issue was brought to the conference board by a member of the conference board, motion made relative to the Nunivak survey area. The conference board requested that the IPHC consider the feasibility of including in the annual survey additional sites around Nunivak Island and doing so in a standard survey grid pattern. Proponents stated that a commercial fishery near Nunivak Island has developed since the mid-80s and that the existing survey does not adequately assess abundance near this island. Proponents identified the social and economic importance of the halibut fishery to the people of Nunivak Island and stated their belief that an expanded survey will result in higher estimated abundance of halibut in this area. The location of additional survey sites were identified by the Nunivak Island Fishermen's Association, who indicated a list of sites had been provided to the commissioners. I have a list of those sites, but we didn't get them all into this report. But if you need those, we can provide them. And that motion passed unanimously. Do you want to add anything?
That's good. You did a very good job.
Thank you very much. So I expect there will be some questions or comments, but I would like to verify the paragraph you said we should delete from this page, back on page 4.
That was not included in the motion. When I took everything out of the blue book and moved it into this section, I copied the whole part, and I realized afterwards this wasn't specifically addressed by the conference board. That you're looking at page 4, that because NIMS has in place a motion for charter operators, that one?
Well, I was asking which one you
okay.
deleted.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Understood.
So page 4, and it's the last paragraph that's part of the action on 3A charters, right above where it says motion passed unanimously, U.S. and Canada.
I have it now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I don't think that, I mean, there was no objection to it. It just was not officially part of the motion, so I wanted to flag that.
I understand that's good bookkeeping. I just didn't want to draw the line to the wrong paragraph. So let's see if there's questions or comments from the commissioners. Paul, please.
Thanks very much for that report, and that's a lot to get through. I had a question on page 6, and it's at the top of the page where it says U.S. members did not support the 2B catch limit, as believe that actions in 2B had been too high in the past and negatively affected recovery of stocks in areas 2C and 2A. And it would seem to me that statement was in conflict with what you read earlier with 2A, in fact that some of the highest catch rates have been occurring in 2A. And in fact, I think when I heard the report yesterday for 2A in particular, is that some fisheries that had 153 days of opening in the past were now down in the 50. And the survey as well as has been up, and hence the recommendation for 2A to increase. And then I would make similar observations for 2C. So my question is, what are those negative impacts?
Thank you. I can try to speak to that based on the discussions that happened at the conference board. The sense was that there were recommendations for big reductions in catch limits over the last 6 years, and over that time 2C went down 76% and has been slowly inching its way back up. 2A took some drops. 2B did not take as big of a reduction in harvest rate as was recommended by Blue Lines over those years. And the sense was that if all areas had taken as big a cut in the harvest rate as 2C in particular, that we would see a faster recovery across all of Area 2, and that we are seeing signs of recovery, that there are at this point some pretty strong sense of strong productivity there, but that reflected a lot of consistency across those areas and should result in a very consistent harvest rate or harvest policy being applied across Area 2.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. I was curious about it. I don't still totally agree that 2B has taken significant reductions too, and looking at what it has been in the past and going back, and it's probably in the order of 50% reductions, and similarly I think in 2C as well. So I had another question, if I could, Jim.
Commissioner Royale, please.
I didn't, this is on page 8. It's the motion, it is the intent of the conference board that no area be penalized or lose quota relative to the conference board recommendations to benefit another area. And it seemed to be a bit of conflict between what was being recommended about a proportional cuts versus leaving it to the discretion of the commissioners. And so maybe if you could just expand a little more on that.
Well, the motion was made. There was a fair bit of discussion about the appropriateness of the motion. We'd made a similar motion in the past when most areas were at the blue line and 1 or 2 were above, and people saying, you know, I'm okay with those few being above, but if the commissioners aren't, you know, don't take it out of those who are at the blue line. This year we have 1 area at the blue line, so the sense was if you're not happy with the total, if you have to reduce, the person who made the motion and those who supported it thought they wanted to see everybody sort of rise and fall or fall proportionally, except for 4C, D, and E that's at the blue line. There are others who didn't think that was a rational recommendation to be making to you as commissioners and voted against the motion. So you can see it had a rather mixed vote and didn't fare well on the Canadian side.
Any other comments or questions?
So Linda and Jim, I wanted to congratulate you guys for being elected to chair this group. Looks like there's 78 groups that you guys corralled and managed, and I think that says a lot. I had a question. Did any of the trawl groups ask for seating at the conference board? Was there any requests from them?
There was not on our side.
So there was no representative from 2B that was specifically representing trawl, although the organization that was accredited probably the last 3 or 4 years participates in a Canadian groundfish. They call it the Commercial Industry Caucus, which is a group of all the hook and line and trawl groundfish fisheries in Canada. One of the representatives that is a trawl representative was there, but not specifically representing trawl interest, more the integrated groundfish fishery groups in BC.
So had they asked for seating, there's no provision to deny them to the conference board?
Our terms of reference require that that people on the conference board represent harvesters, and we had a discussion at the last meeting of whether that should be directed only or qualified in any way, and there was no motion from conference board members to do that. So right now we would allow them to join the conference board if they approached us as harvesters.
Okay. And just follow-up comment, a few years ago there was a couple of trawl interests that were accredited at the conference board. They haven't shown up for quite a number of years. They came for a couple of meetings and then haven't seen them in years.
Yes, I know the Al Birch's group used to come and participate in the conference board.
Whitefish trawlers.
Yeah. That's it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Bob. Anyone else? David, please.
I'd like to express my appreciation for the work of the conference board, all the people that took the trouble to come here and participate in some very important discussions around our fishery, and to the 2 co-chairs who did a great job of compiling all the information in a very legible, readable fashion and running the meetings. And I know you miss out on things like the receptions and stuff. Well, you have to work on this, so we're busy snacking and you're busy working. We really appreciate it. I also just wanted to highlight the two motions that passed unanimously on page 9, the harvest policy motion and bycatch motion. And I really appreciate the thought that went into both of those, and I'd like to assure conference board members that I'm really interested in both of those.
Thank you, we appreciate that.
Thank you. Anyone else? Jeff, please.
Thank you, Linda and Jim, for your report. Just looking at the totals here, the 31.75 million pounds, it looks like that's roughly 5.05 million pounds above the 2016 blue line, or about 19%. And those range anywhere from 41% above the blue line in Area 2B and all the way down to being at the blue line in 4 CD&E. Did you guys have them put this into the risk table and evaluate it in that method?
We didn't look, if I could, Mr. Chairman, we didn't start with the total and work backwards. We went area by area and came up with catch limits. We then came up with the total. Ian generated a table for us so people had all that information in front of them after we'd gone through area by area. And we did note at that time that we ended up quite close to the SPR of 2015 fishing intensity. We're slightly over that, but not by much. And so there was some discussion that gave us a chance to really evaluate the risk in total and people to discuss their comfort level with that. And that was reflected in those comments.
So then it looks like what the conference board did was evaluate it area by area and just kind of decide what they thought the allocation recommendation should be for each of those areas. But did you look at it in total and reevaluate it at that point and say whether we thought it was a good idea or not? I'm assuming not, but I just wonder if you had looked at it in total, because I think that's pretty important.
Yes, we did look at it in total. So we didn't take an additional vote, but we did have the table that showed us all the areas and showed us the total. And the comments that are at the very end of the catch limit. So on page 8, I think it is, there's comments by conference board members on overall catch limits, and that reflects our evaluation of the total.
Thanks. So I had some questions about that as well, but I think Jeff said them better. It kind of looks as if the stock assessments were not appreciated very much by the conference board, and you did individual areas based on your own perceptions, fishing industry's perceptions of how many fish were on the grounds, and not quite following what the stock assessment would be. But the final paragraph, as you point out, shows that you did take a look at overall. So I wish that had been up front, because I was forming this negative idea that you didn't care about the science or the recommendations. You only cared about making the fishery go. At the end, I think it counters that, so it's a well-balanced report, and so I appreciate that. So so that wasn't a question, and I'm not sure the comments that worthwhile, but if you wanted to say something about it, that'd be fine.
I'd be happy to respond. I mean, I do think that we were frequently flipping it through the blue book, looking at weight per unit effort in the survey, and in the commercial fishery, there were comments about whether a 1-year uptick constituted a trend. I mean, people were definitely referring to the science, but people have their own response to the science and also bring in their experience of what they're seeing on the fishing grounds. So you get that whole mix from the conference board.
Thank you. I'm glad I said it. That makes me feel good. So let me ask us just a clarification question on page 9, the harvest policy motion. I agree with the context here. I think that we do need to take a holistic look at the harvest decision tables, the risk tables, all of that stuff. So that's a good way to do it. But your second sentence says the conference board asked the commissioners to direct staff to work with the science review board. Is that the same as the science advisory board? It's Sean Cox, Jim Iannelli, and Mark Mangle? And maybe this is the right name, but that's the group you're talking about.
I think that was intended. That came from the Canadian side to include that step in the process rather than just the MSAB. And I believe that's who they mean.
Okay, thank you very much.
We can double check that.
Any final comments or questions? Paul?
Yes, I had a question about the proposal to reduce the size limit from 30 to, excuse me, from 32 to 30 inches. And when I looked at what's on page 10, don't know if this is exactly appropriate to do, but what I see is that there are 17 in total saying yes and 29 no to the actual motion when you combine the two. And yes, it did pass in the U.S. and did not in Canada, but it seemed to me that there was quite a few more saying no to the proposal. The question I would have, though, is, okay, we've heard for a couple of years from the staff about the change in size limit from 32 to 30. Is that there is potentially some benefits there, and I think the emphasis is on potential because it really depends on what the fishermen's reactions are around that change, and in particular about how they might make some adjustments and select what kind of gears used and hence what's harvested. So it would seem to me that if this was put in place for some period of time, and I think the proposal is 3 years, that would mean there needed to be monitoring to assess whether there is a benefit, because I think as well in our blue book it shows that there under a couple of scenarios there would not be a benefit. So my question to you is, it discussed on what kind of monitoring program could need to go if this was to be approved?
Sure. I mean, go ahead first.
So the overall discussion of the pros and cons of this type of proposal was discussed as laid out in the rationale, the ideas of the potential effects if you don't have monitoring change selectivities, and that kind of wipe out your gains. The response of the proponents to this proposal is quite clear. They don't figure that's going to happen. Those who didn't support it basically laid out just sort of the concerns that you have stated. That's down in the second paragraph. And it was more or less left at that. There was no further sort of details about this proposal coming from the proponent. I suspect that if the commissioners decided that they wanted to try this, that they would work with staff and lay out what really does need to happen. We're not presupposing what the staff and the commission are going to work out how this is going to do. A number of the other things that did not get addressed is sort of such as the differential size limit. That was never discussed between areas. So it's noted in the last paragraph that there is a lot too many, some people thought there are too many uncertainties in the proposal as written to go forward. And that's kind of the general gist of the discussion. There's those that wanted to try it and those that thought more details are required.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that what you just expressed as concerns are largely the reasons that those who voted against it, or were expressed by those who voted against this motion as their reasons for voting against it.
Thanks, Jim and Linda, for that. I think, Jim, one of your comments too is about, it is a differential harvest rate, or excuse me, a differential size limit. It's proposed from areas 3A, 3B, 4A, 4B. So I wonder as well, I guess the other question is about the enforceability and whether there would be potential for some other areas to take advantage. And so that was the other question that I was wondering when I saw the proposal. I don't know how big of a factor that is or not, one way or the other, but I think that would need to be explored too. In my earlier remarks, when I talked about 2B's reduction in the past and was basically from a period of 2006 through 2015 where 2B had taken reductions of roughly 46%, which was comparable to areas 2A and which was about 44%, and area 4 was 47%, and it is less. So to cover all the bases, area 2C did reduce by 56%, but it's in the same ballpark. And in 3A it definitely was greater reductions. It was 60%, and 3B 71%. But I think there is reasons for those differences and why those reductions were larger, and they were responding to the decline in stocks. So I just wanted to provide a more fulsome answer to what that 2B had taken reductions, and they had varied across areas in response to stock.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, yeah, there's lots of time periods you can pick, and 2C took its hits a little bit earlier than some of the other areas, and the high to low was 76%, and that's what sticks in everybody's mind in 2C who went through that period, so that's what comes up in the discussion.
Ted, please.
Yeah, thank you for the report. I want to speak briefly on the monitoring question also, the 30-inch size limit motion. I would think that it would be interesting to find out what the effect would be on the discard mortality rate, given that any fish released from traps wouldn't be wounded by hooks. So that would really be interesting to me to find out what that kind of a plus would be in the big picture. So, finding out that information and moving it across a formula would really be something I'd be interested in seeing. Thank you.
Last comments or questions? Well, thank you. I agree it was a lot of work and a good report. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Can we hear from the PAG group, please? Good morning.
Is this better? Yes. Okay. It was the 21st annual meeting of the Processor Advisory Group. I chaired the meeting since it was U.S. based, and Blake Tipton from SM Products in Vancouver was the co-chair. We convened on Tuesday morning and opened the meeting. There were 17 companies in attendance, including 2 proxies. There were 6 Canadian companies and 9 U.S. companies. Attendance was consistent on both days. As required, the PAG rules of procedure, when the PAG convenes in the U.S., and I've already talked about that, it's a U.S. chair. When it's in Canada, it's a Canadian chair. The PAG is grateful to the following people who provided information to our group as we discussed a variety of subjects. Ian Stewart and Heather Gilroy from the IPHC staff, Rachel Baker from NIMFS, Chris Burrows from the U.S. Coast Guard, Bruce Torres from the Canadian Groundfish Society, Mark Fina from the Alaska Seafood Co-op, Rob Jones from the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, and Dan Hull from the North Pacific Council. As far as the regulatory proposals, we'll go right into those. The PAG approved by unanimous vote of 17 to 0, recommending an open date of March 19th and a closing date of October 31st. It has been our tradition to support a Saturday opening to allow the fish to get to the market for the following weekend and maximize fresh sales opportunities. And another important reason we recommended this starting date is that the Boston Seafood Show is March 6th, 7th, and 8th, and every halibut buyer will be there and make it difficult to move product. And also there are unfavorable tides the week of the 12th. So that's why we based our opening date on that. But it is important to start on a Saturday and not the middle of the week, because we missed that first weekend sales that way, and the fish carries over and loses value. We have traditionally supported an earlier closing and do it again this year for Sunday, October 31st. We have said before and continue to express the significant drop in market interest when quality goes down at the end of the year. Also, Thanksgiving for the retail side, Thanksgiving activity starts in November, and there's less interest in fresh halibut at that time. Also, we support this earlier closing date to allow the IPHC staff to have adequate time to process data for stock assessment in a timely manner. As far as the retention of tagged halibut regulations, we supported the staff recommendations and the vote was unanimous. Log regulations for Alaska commercial fishery, we supported the staff recommendations by unanimous vote to allow the increase in electrical regulations, use of electronic regulation. Government agency proposals, the PAG supported the catch share plans developed by the Pacific Fisheries Management Councils for Area 2 and for the North Pacific Fishery Management Council for 4C, D, and E, as well as the CSP developed by the DFO for Area 2 by unanimous vote. They also supported the catch share plan developed by the North Pacific Council for 2C and 3A by unanimous vote. As far as the proposal for allowing longline pot gear, as we supported the retention of halibut in pot gear as described, but with a request to have a sunset clause after 3 years to see if it's doing what it says it's going to do. We also agree with the intent to allow IFQ holders to retain incidentally caught halibut to reduce wastage, but there was a lot of discussion around the potential for gear conflicts and would request increased monitoring and awareness of that potential. As far as industry regulatory proposals, lowering the commercial fishery size limit to 30 inches, the PAG opposed this proposal by a vote of 12-3. Amend current IPHC fish ticket reporting requirements for Area 2A tribes. The PAG supported this proposal by a unanimous vote. Revise U.S. commercial fishing logbook requirements. We didn't address that for the reasons that were stated in Linda's report. Establish a maximum size retention limit to 60 inches. The PAG took no action on this proposal. And as far as the remaining proposals, we did not address. As far as the catch limits, the PAG approved the following amounts for catch limits in each area. In Area 2A, 1.42 million pounds. Area 2B, 7.35 million pounds. Area 2C, 6.87. Area 3A, 10.1 million. Area 3B, 2.71 million. Area 4A, 1.39 million. Area 4B, 1.16 million. And Area 4D and E, 1.64 million for a total of 32.63. We supported these numbers in Area 2 because if you look at the survey data and the other performance indicators, the fishery has been improving or stable in all of Area 2. Area 2 is probably more homogeneous, at least felt among the PAG, than other areas because Area 2A and 2B have better accounting for all removals, and there is no trawl fishery in Area 2C. So we applied a harvest rate of 29.3%, and that was based on what Area 2B has been harvesting over the last 4 years. And they've harvested at right around that 30%, 28, 29, 30, a little over. And the indicators are still good. So there are some unique things about Area 2, and we treat it as one area. As far as the other areas, we looked at it and looked at the survey results, and in Area 4C, D, and E, in Area 3B, we went to blue line recommendation, and the other areas were based on last year's harvest levels, which seemed to would be based on survey data and so forth to be able to be supported. As far as the only final recommendation we have to the PAG is that we discussed the harvest policy at great length, and strongly recommend the Commission put a high priority on a review of the current harvest policy and identify improvements and updating that needs to be made. Perhaps part of this request could be a good task for the MSAB. And we adjourned yesterday at 3 p.m.
Thank you very much. Are there questions or comments from the commissioners? Bob, please.
So Tom and Blake, thank you for all your work through PAG and running the gauntlet and your presentation. I have a question on the 30-inch versus 32-inch from a marketing standpoint of a frozen under 32-inch fish, so say 30-inch fish versus a fresh market 30-inch fish. Any comment on that? I'm thinking about 3B in areas westward are going to be largely frozen fish market, and if there was a lower size limit out in that area, what are the processors' view of a frozen smaller fish versus a fresh smaller fish?
Well, there was some discussion about that, Mr. Commissioner, and there is no question that historically smaller fish has been, from a market standpoint, has been lower priced in the market. It's less desirable, and that's pretty historical. So, and certainly as far as a frozen product, if it's going to be processed, that's probably even less desirable on the smaller side than a fresh product would be.
Thank you.
I guess part of the question would be, would the smaller frozen fish affect the smaller frozen, less valuable fish, affect the market for the fresh, large fish that would be east? Is there a concern that if allowing a 30-inch fresh fish, which is largely where the fish are frozen, is there a concern that that would bring down the price of the fresh, large fish that would be, for example, in 2C or 2B?
Well, I think it's a combination of things, Mr. Chairman. It could do that. I mean, theoretically, the bigger supply would lower the market for all sizes. If you had a bigger supply of small fish, it could lower the size for all of it, or lower the market, excuse me. And the other thing is that there's just less desirable for that small fish. You know, it costs, and from just a cost standpoint, it costs as much to process small fish as it does the large from a processor side almost. So there are some significant concerns.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions here? Paul, please.
Thanks very much for the report, and to you, Tom and Blake. I noticed there's quite a difference between Conference Board and PAG on season opening dates. Conference Board was looking March 3rd through November the 7th, and your proposal is March the 19th with a closing October the 31st. You stressed the importance of a Saturday start, but there seems to be quite a bit of a gap between the two, and I guess that's not totally non-traditional, but that just seems bigger than it has been in the past in my memory as far as the recommendations.
Saturday, we have had a Saturday. I've been attending these meetings for 13 years. We've had a Saturday opening since I've been attending, and there are some very significant market reasons to do that, to allow companies and harvesters to get product in so we can get that following weekend sales. That's very significant and important. As far as our dates, we have been consistent in stressing the need to close early for IPHC staff to gather stock assessment data. And we just looked at the opening, and the week of the 12th, the tides were not favorable. And traditionally, most harvesters don't go out in March anyhow.
Any other questions? Jeff, please.
Thank you for the report. Just wondering from a market standpoint, it looks like the FCY year over year from 2015 to 2016 under your recommendation would be roughly 6 million pounds, or about a 22% increase from last year's allocation, actual allocation to your recommendations. Will that 6 million pounds of that increase of about 22% make a difference in the market or put downward pressure on pricing?
You know, that's a very good question. It could lower the market, but I think generally processors and harvesters have worked together to kind of time deliveries and effectively move them into the marketplace. But yes, when you have more, it could affect the market.
Mr. Tipton, any advice for us?
Where do you want me to start? Good morning. Now, just one further comment to Tom's on market conditions by their recommended increase by both the conference board and the PAG. The adopted FCEY last year was 29.22 million pounds. And so the increase this year is basically slightly over 3. To the best of my knowledge, based on my limited experience, there's not much frozen inventory around. To comment on the discrepancy or the difference between PAG and the conference board's opening dates, the conference board has always, as you know, Dr. Balsiger recommended an earlier opening date than PAG, and then part of that could be years ago they were concerned about farmed halibut entering into the marketplace, which to date has really not had an effect on us here on the West Coast. So March the 19th, PAG has always wanted an October 31st opening because of the lack of interest or the dying interest by the customers. Plus most of us are getting older. And other than that, I have no other advice. I mean, you guys have always done a fantastic job, and we've done our best to give you our unbiased or our objective point of views from both the conference board and the PAG and what we see during the full length of the season that we're involved in. So we appreciate the opportunity, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Last chance. Well, thank you very much for giving us that advice, and we do take it to heart, so appreciate the work that you do. So thank you. Let's see, so we will hear from the Management System Advisory Board, Michelle Culver, Adam Kelzer. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, sorry, before we get there, if you'll permit me to make a public service announcement. We've been approached by a number of harvesters concerned about the presentation of area-specific things in some of our graphical materials. And in particular, the chart we're using on the graph, sometimes looking at boundaries among regulatory areas, so particular area 2B, 2C, and 2A and 2B. And I can state unequivocally that the description of those boundaries is wrong. And the recommendation was to go back to a figure that we had used before. I can also unequivocally say that that figure is wrong. There's a theme here. So what is it? The two governments have not agreed on a boundary between United States and Canada in either 2A, 2B, or 2B, 2C. Anything we put up there is going to be wrong. We have standard procedures about how catch is allocated within those areas. A vessel fishing in that boundary area, if it's a U.S. vessel, gets U.S. allocated catch. If it's in the Canadian area, it gets Canadian allocated catch. So please, to all of you, anything we put up there will always be wrong until the two governments resolve the boundaries. Thank you.
Is it possible the governments are wrong and our chart's right? So MSAB, Adam and Michelle.
Yes.
Good morning, go ahead.
Good morning, Commissioners. So just starting off with a brief recap of the Management Strategy Advisory Board and who we are. So I am Michelle Culver. I work for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and represent the Pacific Fishery Management Council on the Management Strategy Advisory Board and one of the co-chairs of the group. And with me is Adam Kaiser from Canada Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the other co-chair for the MSAB. And the MSAB was formed in 2013 by IPHC as a formal stakeholder-driven process to evaluate management procedures against a range of scenarios. We're comprised of 24 official and ex officio members representing commercial, sport, processing, tribes, First Nations, fisheries councils, and managers. We meet twice a year in May and October and have had 5 meetings to date and made significant progress in our meetings in 2015 relative to governance changes, and I think some good discussion and focus by the MSAB relative to our roles and responsibilities.
So as Michelle mentioned, the MSAB is relatively new, especially compared to Conference Board and PAG. And we're really taking advantage of this opportunity at the annual meeting to talk to the other advisory groups. The MSAB doesn't normally meet at the annual meeting. This is really a chance for us to reach out and work with some of the other groups. So I'll give a brief update of some of the work that we've accomplished over the past year and some of the comments we've received from the other advisory processes during this annual meeting. So one thing first, as Michelle mentioned, there was some significant progress in 2015 with respect to the governance structure of the MSAB. That includes the identification of co-chairs, the establishment of an agenda setting committee, and the hiring of facilitators to help run a lot of the meeting administration. The facilitators have also developed an outreach plan to assist the MSAB in engaging other interests in the halibut resource. So in our past year, meetings covered many governance discussions, and in particular in our October meeting, we discussed the evolving roles and responsibilities of MSAB members. We reviewed the progress to date, and we've talked about how we can, we acknowledged the progress that we've made, but we also talked about how we can move things along in a more proficient manner. A couple of the action items that were presented at the last October meeting was for Michelle and myself to present at the interim meeting and at the annual meeting to share what's happened. So we did that at the interim meeting. We've had discussions on Monday and throughout the session over the past 2 days. One of the other items has been to share our outreach plan, or at least start to work on the outreach plan with the other advisory groups. The outreach plan that was developed by the facilitators indicated a few challenges. We're dealing with a diverse and dispersed group of stakeholders. The management strategy evaluation material is complex, and it means folks can contribute at different levels to the process. And there's also a general lack of understanding about how the process is going to work. The intent of the MSAB is not to usurp the role of PAG or Conference Board by any means. And so we had some good discussions over the past week about that with folks in the room. The outreach plan also identified a set of objectives. In particular, we want to develop a communication strategy that allows us to inform folks in a timely and consistent manner. We want to be able to gather input effectively. We want to be able to make sure that folks can engage in the process. So this outreach plan was presented with individuals at the annual meeting, and the board itself is going to review this report in more detail at our next meeting in May. So at the at this meeting, we discussed some of the specific deliverables for the management strategy evaluation that we've seen over the past year. We solicited feedback from individuals on our draft fishery objectives, as well as some proposed management procedures. So I'll highlight some of the feedback we've seen, but I will put a caveat on that. This report's drafted in advance of the conclusion of PAG and Conference Board. So some of the feedback we received this morning is in addition to what you've seen here. So in general, MSAB, the communication from the MSAB to the other advisory boards, particular PAG and Conference Board, is very important. Folks had suggested that agency staff like Michelle and myself play an important role in communicating from the MSAB to other interests in Canada and the US. There's an incomplete thought, the second bullet, the beginning of the next page there, about identifying commission staff to liaise with Conference Board and PAG. It's not so much that we think there should be a commission staff to liaise with it, but a commission staff liaison from the MSAB to other advisory processes. The conference board reviewed some of the draft objectives that have been presented, and we also had a chance to sit down with conference board and go through the MSE tool that was developed largely by Dr. Martel. So conference boards expressed interest in this process, and they shared some feedback on particular management approaches. They talked about considering maximum size limits. They talked about the need to develop a spatial modeling approach, in particular because of their interest in spatial fishery objectives. Conference board members also expressed a desire to examine longer-term fishery objectives, or at least longer-term with respect to the timeframes we see in the current decision tables. The next steps for our group are to meet in May 2016 with Dr. Alan Hicks, and the MSAB is very pleased to hear that there's been a person identified to help lead the group. So at this May meeting, we will be formally reviewing the outreach plan that's been received from the facilitators. We will be reviewing our revised terms of reference that have come out of our governance changes, and we'll be developing a new work plan given the new staff. That concludes our report. Michelle, do you have anything else to? Okay, so we'll be happy to hear questions.
Thank you. That's a nice summary. Do we have comments or questions? I don't see any questions here, but so I'll have a comment, I guess, that I noted that the conference board in particular identified a ambitious role for the MSAB over the next year to look at harvest decision methods, harvest, whatever we want to call them now in the new decision table era. So it looks like you have your work cut out for you, and I'm looking forward to seeing how you do on that. Paul does have a comment.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I was going to make the same comment. It's clear from the reports by the conference board and PAG that's looking for some work to accelerate on harvest policy, and suggesting or recommending that the MSAB be that vehicle, and obviously in conjunction with IPHC staff. I guess the question I have on that for you, Adam and Michelle, is like, do you think you now have the process in place with the changes that you went through, Adam, that will help undertake to do that? Do you think that maybe there are still too many questions that are coming your way? And one of the common things I've heard, Bruce is chuckling, is that there's been a lot of questions thrown at the MSAB, and I guess what I'm roundabout way and rambling way of getting to is that it sounds like a priority on what's being proposed here, and some of these other things are much lower in priority. And so do you think you have solid direction at this point, or maybe that's not a fair question to you at this point, you'll get it from the commission later. But do you have, do you think you now have a process in place will work much better than it was in the past?
Thank you for the question. So I would agree, and I think I can speak for Michelle. We've heard from board members, MSAB members as well, that a review of the harvest control rules and of the broader harvest policy is the priority. I mean, that's essentially what the group was brought together for in the first place. I think some of the challenges have been over the past few years is getting folks up to speed about what management strategy evaluation is, getting people engaged in the process, and at the same time staff developing the infrastructure to help teach us and actually start to do that evaluation. So I think that explains the reason why it's taken us the amount of time to get from A to B. And frankly, looking at other management strategy processes, we seem to be about on par with those. Answering your question directly about do we have clear direction, yes, I think so. It's evaluating the harvest control rule is a clear priority, and it's definitely of our interest. The question that I can't answer is if we can get it done in the sort of time frame that's been proposed. It's not a big deal for Michelle and I because we're not the ones actually writing up the harvest control rule. So I'd have to defer to staff. It's about what resources are available to do that.
The only other thing I would add is, yes, I do think that the governance changes that we've made have really strengthened the MSAB process, and I think we're better positioned to examine the management procedures and the harvest policy now than we were previously. But with the change in our staff support will, I think, help having a conversation with Dr. Hicks about the timing and what is needed to get there from here, I think will help address the question you were asking.
Well, thank you very much. Good report. So I'm talking to the executive director. We contemplate some public comment, and I'm trying to decide if we've been here long enough that we need to stretch our legs. And so I'm going to suggest that we take 15 minutes and come back. We will have public comment. I would like to remind you we have heard good reports from the PAG and the conference board, which both groups have taken some pains to represent both sides of the issue. And so I'm not trying to say you can't talk about it, but we don't want to spend the rest of the day on public comment. Jeff, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to correct inaccuracy in the numbers that I used when asking Blake and Tom a question earlier about what the market effect may be from the increases. The number that I was using was this year's blue line FCEY rather than last year's council adopted FCEY. So the increase from last year's actual allocations to this year's PAG recommendations was actually 3.41 million pounds and an increase of 11.7%. So just wanted to note that correction.
Thank you, appreciate that. So let's try to come back at 10:45 and we will go through public comment as much as we can. Thanks. Thanks for getting back in. It was a little longer than I said, but it's mostly because things are buzzing around in my mind. I'm not quite sure what I'm thinking on some things, so I wasn't waiting for you. I was waiting for myself to catch up. So appreciate you being back. So we're going to try to take public comment on what we heard this morning relative conference board, PAG, MSAB reports. We don't have a sign-up list, so I don't know if we're looking forward to 1 comment or 100 comments. So try to be concise, I guess, in your remarks. We want to hear your remarks, but as concise as you can be. So without a list, let's start with volunteers. First, we have Ms. Benkin, who has, I think, a couple notes on their conference board report.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are just 3 errors in our conference board report that I wanted to correct. I will make these changes in writing and get them to you as quickly as I can do that as well. The first is on page 4 under the area 3A charters. And we had stated in our 3rd sentence, we had slightly misstated that in the 3rd sentence. The intent is to limit permits as well as vessels to a trip per calendar day. So there, the word vessel per that's in the 4th line down there should be crossed out. and then a sentence added that says also limit each vessel to 1 trip per calendar day. So I'll make that change and get it to you in writing.
So I'm sorry, which paragraph would that be in under Area 3A charters?
It's in the first paragraph under Area 3A charters. If you count down to the 4th line where vessel per is right there at the end of the left-hand side, and just cross that out.
So the sentence reads, it's limited to 1 charter halibut fishing trip per calendar day.
And then the next sentence that needs to be added is also limit each vessel to 1 trip per calendar day. We tried to make it all one sentence and it sort of changed the meaning, and we'll separate that out and correct it.
Thank you very much.
And then the other very important one, I think as we went through, I noticed that we had the vote right, but the outcome wrong for 3B. Actually, the 3B FCUI recommendation of 3 million pounds passed in Canada. So you should change that in your notes that it was passed in both the US and Canada. And the actual numerical vote was right, but we put failed even though the number showed that it passed.
Thank you. So on the top of page 5, there's no need for a parenthetical phrase after 3B's 3.00 million pounds.
That's correct.
And on page 7, we can say where it talks about 3B, motion passed on U.S. Section 2865, Canada approved 1729.
That's correct, yeah. And then there's just one more, at least one more that people have pointed out to me so far. This one's a little bit longer, and again, I'll get it back to you in writing, but that's in the comments from conference board member on the overall catch limits, and I think it's an important one. If you read down through that, where there's a statement that one conference board, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines up from the bottom, one conference board representative expressed concern that the 2015 SPR and 2016 recommendation could represent an F30 fishing intensity, given the confidence interval range around that estimate, and put a period there. The next sentence should be crossed out, and instead it should say, additionally, and I'll get this to you in writing, but additionally, at the blue line, there is a 33% chance that the FCUI in 2017 declines by 10%. Next sentence, at the harvest level recommended by the conference board, there's a greater than 50% chance of FCY decline by 10% in 2017. I think that's important because Commissioner Kaufman had asked me about our evaluation of the total risk, and that sentence misstated concerns that were expressed. So I'll get these made in a clean copy and get those corrections to you.
Thank you very much for bringing that forward. Any questions? Linda, just one second.
If I could just ask a question on page 4, and I'm certain this is probably correct. Under the second paragraph under 3A charters, the last sentence, it says if an annual limit is required for area 2, and I assume you mean area 2C there?
It should definitely say 2C.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments?
My name's Ken Wing, from Area 2B fisherman. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the presentation that the Amendment 80 fleet made to the conference board yesterday, and how they laid out for us what they're doing to better the management of the halibut resource and the costs that they're incurring and how they're planned forward and the timelines that they presented with us for achieving some of those things. And Jim, yes, science in the conference board is always paramount. It's one thing which we continually discuss. And the fundamentals, basic fundamentals, is understanding the size of the resource and the total removals. And then we can go from there. Now, in the management regime which I operate under, my total removals are reported with a lot of confidence. Each year, when I do my income tax, I look at what I pay to have those figures presented to you. And it's a substantial amount of money. So I look and I say to myself, well, where do I get the return on that money? And there's a lot of things that contribute to that. And then when we start down a process, a lot of times we have a lot of fears. When we started down the process we did, there was a lot of fear, and there's, resistance to change, which is a natural thing. And a lot of the fears have, real foundation, but ultimately they sometimes prove to be unfounded. I can only speak from personal experience and some of the fears that we had. And one of the fears was that the small boat was going to be squished out as we went to IPQs. And the costs of the programs and different things were going to cause problems. Stuff. Well, here I am today, owning not one, but now 2 small boats. And I'm paying my costs. And I'm also believe that my the financial foundation of my business is a lot stronger. And when I look at where do I get the benefits of that cost, I look in a number of different places. And each year when I come here, in the blue book is a line which says what my catch per unit effort is in our area. And I'll point out that it's one of the highest levels that's ever been attained in Area 2B. Part of one of those contributing factors, I believe, and there is a number of factors which contribute to that, is the regime which we fish under. And I'll note that as we go, I look back on history, there was more fish caught with less pounds per skate. So today, here I am, part of a 2B fishery, which is catching more fish per skate on a lesser amount of fish. So obviously my economics of the halibut fleet has got to be, better. The footprint that we leave behind obviously is better, which may not have a benefit that goes to the bottom line directly, but it does, because we're a user of the resource, and if our footprint is smaller, it's got to eventually contribute to all users of that resource. Now, as we go forward, I want to speak to the new, or at least what's being termed halibut management strategy, which is being formed, and the importance of that particular body. And you as commissioners, your responsibility in that. And that's the management of the halibut resource. And part of that management is fundamentally making sure that we know what our removals are. And ultimately, we need to know those numbers with confidence before we can move even farther forward. And I'd just like to point out that I still live in a small community. And my well-being goes back into that community, and it's spread throughout. So everybody that I deal with has a direct impact on them through the management of this resource. And so far as I can see, when I equate back to that cost that I'm paying to have myself monitored in that fashion, I'm getting a return.
Thank you very much. Next, please, Chris.
Chris Spohr from Canada. I'd like to respond to some of the comments made by commissioners on the conference board report. The first comment we heard is that one of the comments was that we had ignored the stock assessment. I don't think it's a fair statement. I think if you look on page 8, it's very clear that we referred to the decision table, which is the output from the stock assessment, in what our total catch recommendations were. Okay, so I think that needs to be acknowledged. The second thing I'd like to comment on is we've heard for some time that the decision table is the output, it is the staff recommendations, and that was emphasized at the beginning of this meeting. We've heard it for the last couple of years, that the entire decision table is the recommendation. And that the blue line is the application of the current harvest policy, which we've also heard is somewhat dated and needs to be reviewed and evaluated, hence the motions from the conference board and PEG. But we just heard in the comments to this report that we, for lack of a better, we deviated from the word recommendation of the staff. And what I'm asking for here is from commissioners and the staff, and I don't need it now, we can discuss it, we can get it later today or before the next intermeeting, is some clarity as to what the recommendation is, and then some consistency in how it's applied, because it is an issue that keeps cropping up in the conference board. People say it's a recommendation, people say the whole table's a recommendation. Just would like some consistency. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree with that last part, and this isn't necessarily a back and forth, and I may have said what you attribute to me at the very first, but what I meant to say was that as I read through the conference board paragraph by paragraph, there wasn't much reference to the stock assessment or the work that had been done or the decision tables, so I was pleased to see that it had been taken up in the final paragraph where they pointed out that they'd looked at that. So it was a pat on the back incorporating the advice and the information that was done by the stock assessment. I recognize I started out negatively, so I probably could have said it better, but that was my point, so thanks for bringing that forward. And let's see, who else, please?
I'm Jim Whitethorn from 2C. I just wanted to make a quick little statement here that I hope when you're evaluating the number for 2C that you do realize, and I know there's some people thought like, well, you know, you get a pretty high percentage increase in 1 year. They kind of have a hard time with that, but we took a 47% decrease in one meeting. So you kind of should be reminded of that, I think, when you're thinking about that. And the only other thing I got to say is that 2C, excuse me, 2C with the highest number per unit effort and the highest weight per unit effort of any area, with which the availability of stock and the lowest bycatch wastage of 1.5% and a 12-year increase in the survey population, we feel that possibly our biomass could be misstated a little bit, and we're hoping that you know, we can really be looking at that compared to past history. So, but anyway, I appreciate you guys. I'm quite impressed with the area that we, and the building here that we had. I've never been to a meeting in Juneau of this magnitude, and it was quite amazing. And that Hannah host party last night was really amazing. I lived here 40-some years in Alaska. This next door here, I've never been in the White House. Pretty darn nice, but it's a great party, and thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I've had at the top of my page of every session today, applaud and thank Hannah for the wonderful reception, and get to the state, whoever is responsible to make the governor host us. And I forgot to say it every time, so I was saving till the end, but since you brought it up, you deserve our thanks and applause. Hannah put on a wonderful feed. It was quite entertaining. I didn't catch all of it. I got a little bit at the beginning, a little bit at the end, but thank you very much. And while I'm on it, the IPHC reception here in the building on Tuesday was also good. I may have eaten too many of those spicy things, but it was good, so thanks. And anyone else? That was not a public commenter. We'll have a couple here. So.
Thank you, fellow commissioners. I'm James Phillips from Pelican. I have 2C and 3A quota now. I appreciate all the work that the conference board has done and PAG. Look forward to hearing your recommendations tomorrow. I guess I'm just going to direct this last comment at Dr. Bruce Lehman. Thank you for all your hard work and effort. Apologize for my wife putting you on the spot the other day. This process it's grown from the few years that I've attended a few meetings. I said I'd come to all of them, but it's really hard to get out of Pelican in the winter. That's not an excuse. We did visit on webinar. That's really great. I encourage more people to do it. It's growing. There's more sectors into the meetings. It's pretty obvious when you sit around and look at the conference board now, and it takes up a lot of the room. Years ago, it was just a couple dozen people. I guess I'm talking 40 years ago. I've been commercial fishing since I was 6 years old in 1966. I've missed 2 seasons since then, and they've pretty much, it's you folks and the scientific. We used to refer to it as SSC, and now it's something else. But to echo, I guess Mr. Wing's comment is, we do take it seriously, health of our resource. Don't get me wrong, I'm greedy. But I think this year was the only year that I've taken up past my percentage of quota. Luckily, I stayed underneath the 9.8 overage due to the fact that they were really big fish. So in conservation measures, we try to always leave a little bit on the table. I mean, I am greedy, but I'm not that greedy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. And in terms of heartfelt testimony, there's no need to apologize. I'll tell you, it's a lot, and I know you were speaking to Dr. Lima, but it's a lot easier to hear criticism here than through some anonymous blog. So please, next.
Thank you. My name is Joel Hansen with the boat company in Sitka. And I would just like to take this opportunity to advocate on behalf of a conservative as opposed to a liberalized catch rate or catch limit. In Southeast Alaska in Area 2C, we operate week-long charters between Sitka and Juneau, and we fish a lot of waters that are not associated with a community like Sitka or Juneau or Ketchikan. And we see a lot of big fish on our cruises. And we would like to see the trend using the graph from the Blue Book, which shows that Area 2C has reached the bottom of its arc and is turning up now. And there is a spread that shows the confidence interval, which could be either a continuing upward curve or possibly a downward curve. And the more that curve is allowed to turn up, the less the fish that will have to release with reduced mortality. We would appreciate it if you would consider the benefits of having that continue to turn up for a while to improve the prospects of sport fishermen not having to release fish. Thank you.
Thank you. Does the boat company sit on either the PAG or the conference board?
Yes, we do. I'm on the board of SEGO, and SEGO voted. I would be in the minority.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Thank you. This won't be the last chance we'll have public comment. I believe at the end of today's final session, which will be in this room. But is there anyone else for just now? Otherwise, Steve has someone online maybe. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have one question from online. Kevin Abena asks, concerning the 30-inch size reduction proposal, is there any data concerning the amount the discard mortality rate might fall? Also, is there a chance that it wouldn't fall and in turn transfer the rate to a smaller class of fish over a course of years? So the effect on DMR of changing the minimum size limit.
I think there's not good information, but perhaps we could ask one of the scientists to give their best opinions.
Mr. Chair, if I can, we did revisit this last year. We have visited several times in the MSAB process, and I could ask Dr. Stewart during your detailed discussion of the regulatory proposal this afternoon to go through some of that stuff if you wish.
Okay, thanks. I think that's a good idea, so we can take a look at that. You suggested detail, but probably we won't do great detail, but some talk about it. So, thanks. And that's the end of the online questions. And I see no more questions in the room. So we will. Do we have a different session, or we just continue the session in a different mode? Not that it matters what we call it. So we're going to continue now. It's our. This will be our administrative session 5 continuing, wherein we will discuss the conference board report and the PAG report, and anything about MSAB. So let's, rather than sequentially talk about those 3, let's talk about catch limits in the context of all of the reports and see if there's any comments or questions or statements by the commissioners. Paul, please.
It's not so much, excuse me, so much directly to the reports. It's, I guess, tangential and based upon Mr. Spore's comments. I think my view, excuse me, the IPHC staff has been clear that the entire decision table is the advice, and that when we look at that decision table, it's the entire decision table is the harvest advice, and it's up to us as commissioners, based upon the PAG and the conference board and the also public comments, to take all those factors into account to come up with an outcome about the risks that we're collectively as a commission to decide upon on the harvest advice. So I just wanted to put that out there in response to Chris's question. I don't know, Jim, whether we need to say anything or write anything around that, but if there is that lack of clarity, maybe we should and should consider that.
Thank you. I think it'd be useful, and as Mr. Spore said, it doesn't have to be now, but at another meeting to identify that very clearly, and I think you have most of the salient points, but there might be an example or two that we could put onto a one-page document next year to show in the context that the decision table as it is the advice of the staff. Thank you. Any other comments? So I have a comment. Obviously pleased, as Dr. Stewart mentioned. I think that he was here presenting stock assessments with some optimism. I think he said for the first time it was. He's an optimistic man, so he's probably it wasn't the first time, but it's the first time we had a fairly positive look in most of the areas after some long decline. And I mentioned that perhaps at the opening meeting that I've been here since for 15 or 16 years, I guess, and pretty much since I've been here, the stock has been determined to be going down and the quotas have reduced. And now you can look through the data and the reports and find out that's not universally true, because we've had some ups and we've had some downs, but generally speaking, you know, from 100 million pounds coastwide down to with a set line of near 70 million pounds down to less than 30 is a fairly long-term, over a long-term, big decline. And as that turns around now, and I think it is turning around, I think it's turning around because of good advice from the science side of the Halibut Commission. It's turning around because of tough decisions that the commissioners have had to make. It's turned around because of the conference board and the advisory, the PAG and the conference board recognizing that there were problems. It's turned, part of the decline was because of the size and age problems that we've had. The fish are so much smaller than they were in 2000. But it's optimistic. But after that long decline, with a year or two of upturn, I'm optimistic, but I'm very conservative, and I'd like to see that resource grow more. So it may have been at the last year's meeting, I said I'm kind of a blue line guy. Blue line is not the harvest policy anymore. It used to be part of the harvest policy, but to me the blue line is still a pretty good reference number. So it actually takes quite a bit of evidence for me personally to think that, well, the blue line is there, but we can add another 30% to it. So I'm struggling with some of what I would see as a relatively aggressive schedule put forward by the PAG and the conference board. So we're going to talk about those a little bit and think about them, probably think about them more than talk, but I'm a little bit nervous about some of these levels, and so that's kind of the background of where I'm looking as we start a back and forth. And I'm sure that Paul is going to have to say something about that.
Sure. Well, others collect their thoughts. I would add one other thing too, and about the risk decision table. It's come up a number of times, I think, in the discussions this morning too, about that we need to get on with, and it's not that we've been doing nothing. I don't mean to apply that by get on, but I think increased urgency, I guess, is what I sense in the room around dealing with the harvest policy and the development of either a new one or and being clear about what that looks like. And so that's what I do sense, and I think that the steps that we've taken so far to develop the MSAB are going to be an asset for doing that. But I also think that we as commissioners need to provide some clear direction to the MSAB about what they need to focus on, and maybe spend some less time on some other items that could be maybe removed from their long list of requests. For example, bycatch. I mean, it's an issue that comes up continually, or a lot for sure, and I think the proposal from the North Pacific Fishery Management Council to have a more formal relationship with the Commission and the Council would be a good step to address bycatch issues and have that discussion more than in an MSAB. I think the MSAB could assist us, as well as the council staff, technical staff, and the MSAB could provide some scenarios. But I really think, my personal opinion, is that the MSAB should focus on spending their efforts around the harvest policy, and because of I think the urgency to clear up some ways of how we can move forward. If focusing on 2016 and what's been proposed by Conference Board and PAG as far as the recommended abundance harvest levels for the various regulatory areas, I guess I share somewhat your view, Jim, that there needs to be some consideration of maybe it's a little bit too ambitious at this time. I think over the 4 years I've heard Ian talk about, things are, he's cautious in his views, and I really welcome that actually in the stock assessment. I think we need to be careful and that he expressed some optimism, but I don't think that means we should take terribly large increases. And one of the things, policies in the past have been fast down, slow up. I don't know that doesn't necessarily mean what's being proposed right now is fast up, but it's maybe a little bit more than we think we're comfortable at this point, but I think we still have to discuss that as commissioners.
Thank you. I appreciate that. On the harvest policy and the MSAB exploring that, you pointed out to me this morning, and I hadn't caught it before, that there are slightly different elements in the tables in 2B than there are in 2C and 3A. And so a casual glance at those tables doesn't give you a fair representation of exploitation rates, particularly of those parts that we negotiate here. And I don't mean that to be confusing, but it took me a long time to catch on. And so I think we have to give some rather tight instructions, as you said, to the MSAB in the MSE process so they can look around at those things. Equity is paramount between the two nations, I think, in order to make this treaty, the treaty work. So we have to be able to explain why the recommendations are equitable. And that doesn't mean that you have to have the same exploitation rate in every area, because every area is different, but we have to be able to explain why our decisions are equitable between the two nations, and I think there's some presentation changes that could be made that would help that a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree, Jim, and I don't think we can accomplish it at this meeting, but I think we can work on it for the next and have a more fulsome discussion around it about how issues like, for example, wastage are handled within the, whether they're in the FCE or why, or whether they're in the total, and how that's treated equally across the parties. But it's probably too far to do at this meeting, but we can certainly work on it for the future.
Thank you. Any other comments on catch limits at this time? Jeff?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to say that I really appreciated hearing from the Conference Board and PEG this morning. Got a kind of a sneak peek yesterday at some of the recommendations coming from those two advisory bodies, and I was quite a bit surprised by some of the numbers that I had heard, and so it was good to get some rationale this morning behind those numbers. Looking at the Conference Board and the PEG recommendations, they have some areas quite significantly above the blue line. Specifically in the Conference Board had in Area 2A a recommendation of 30% above the blue line, and PEG had 39% above the blue line. And it grows even larger when you get over to 2B, where they're looking at, both bodies were looking at about 41% over the blue line and over 2 million pounds in that one specific area. And then you get over to 2C, and PEG was recommending an allocation of 49% above the blue line. I think those are very significant, and I have some fear about those numbers. I see a lot of hope and stability in these areas, particularly in 2C, where they've seen steady increases for a significant amount of time. I think the trend in 2B has been relatively flat, and although we saw a good spike in 2A, I think that's kind of an anomaly, quite possibly, understanding that it is getting healthier and the reports on the grounds are that fishing is improving. I think we still need, I think as Jim mentioned, we're a long ways from where we'd like to be. Obviously we're heading in the right direction, particularly in Area 2, we need to be somewhat responsible and try to grow the resource in these particular areas. I have particular concerns about areas 3A and 3B, and 3A is still somewhat on a declining trend, and 3B, although starting to curve in the upward direction on the survey weight per unit efforts, is still at historically low levels. And I think these areas in particular need more time to turn that corner and start to rebound. And I think particularly in 3A and 3B, we're a long ways from where we need to be. Overall, it looks like the Conference Board is recommending allocations 19% above the blue line, with the current harvest rate combined of 22.4%, and PAG is recommending allocations 22% above the blue line at nearly 6 million pounds with a harvest rate of 22.9%. So I think the Commissioner's got some really good rationale from these two advisory bodies this morning. We've got a lot of work to do, I think, tonight informing our decisions. But at the end of the day, it's our responsibility to be stewards of the resource, and I think some of these numbers are a bit aggressive, so I think I'll leave it at that.
So, Mr. Chairman, I like to echo Jeff and Jim's and Paul's comments. I see hope, and I see 3, 4, 5, 6 years in a row of ups in the surveys and CPUE numbers from the commercial numbers in Area 2, and there's a reason for some increases, though I think there's a bit of too much aggression there coming out of the PAG and Conference Board, but there's a real sense of that we've turned a corner there in Area 2. The commercial CPUE numbers, I'm not sure, remember what page they are in the blue book, but I think there's 9 areas, and I think all but one area showed an up, particularly in areas 3 and 4, but many of those are just a first year up after 15 years of decline, like in 3A and 3B. So I'm really kind of go slow in those areas out west. So I think that echoes what other people have said. So those are my comments.
Thank you. So if we have nothing more right at the moment on catch proposals, perhaps we could take consideration of regulatory proposals, and we probably have a better order to do this, but I'm going to page through the Conference Board report as we talk about them. So the first thing I believe that we have is the season date. We have disparate recommendations of quite a bit on the opening of the season, March 3rd, which I guess must be a Thursday if the PAG's date of March, I've got too many papers. If March 19th is a Thursday, I guess the 3rd must not be. Is there any comments on those? I guess the 3rd.
I think the PAGS was a Saturday.
Yeah, so the 3rd would not be a Saturday, I think. I can add 7 and 7 and not get from 3 to 19, and even third is a Thursday, and the 19th is a Saturday. And first of all, I guess we'd ask the agency people, can we get regs in place by the 3rd? That'd be my agency people, but
Good morning, Commissioners. Rachel and I have talked about it, and we've in the past said it takes us 5 weeks to get the regulations in place. That's a little less than 5 weeks. That would take you to the Saturday opening date. We could do our best. We could try our best to get them in place by the 3rd. It will be a push.
All right. Bob.
So What do the tides do on the 5th, which is a Saturday, which would be complementary to, someone from the conference board, the harvesters, speak to that? Or did they discuss that, Linda or Jim? I don't see either one of them in the audience right now.
Linda's over there, but
So there was quite a bit of discussion over the tides on the 3rd. And then the other dates that were mentioned in the report, I believe it was the 19th?
Yeah, the dates that I recall
Well,
being
yeah.
good times were the 3rd and the 19th.
And maybe the 12th, something around there. 14th. The Thursday opening was done by, actually it was a conscious decision by the proponent of that date. They had their own reasons for it. So they did not think that a Saturday was that important, as has been traditional with the PAG. That was a conscious decision by the proponent. And the earlier date of the 3rd, as was said, it's favorable tides separating out the other fisheries that start in the beginning of April, get the long lining, getting those who are going to do a lot of their long lining before they start salmon fishing, that type of thing.
okay, thank you. Any questions?
I see Linda looking at the tide book, so I was wondering if she might have any comments on the difference between the 3rd and the 5th.
I don't know that doesn't look like that's all that significant, at least for South Central. But that does look like you get into minus tides. You get too much past that, at least if in South Central.
So it's not easy to compromise between the 3rd and the 19th if the middle week there is bad tide. So we'll just have to think about it. Do we have enough information to go on? Okay, thank you very much. After the season dates, which was the first thing the conference board did, they completed all the catch sharing plans. Is there any questions about catch sharing plans that the commissioners have? It's slightly different than the catch limits, but.
I don't have any questions, Jim.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. So if we skip on the conference board past all of the catch questions, the catch recommendations, they talked about harvest policy. Paul and I have talked about that a bit up here as we were discussing catch limits and the role that we believe that the MSAB could play. Is there anything else we should talk about right now? Okay, thank you. There is a bycatch motion. I don't feel like reading it out right now. We can glance at it. I don't know that it kind of expresses the philosophy of the commission that we need to continue working on bycatch reductions. Paul's idea that maybe that's a good agenda item for a joint meeting with the council and the commission makes a lot of sense to me. Is there any additional thoughts? If not, we get to the industry regulatory proposals. The first one the conference board looked at was lowering the minimum size limit to 30 inches. So just to start the discussion, I've actually sort of been I actually have been a proponent of trying a reduced size limit. I think that through the years, we've had different recommendations or reviews of that by the scientific staff. I think the scientific staff right now, the commission is not particularly interested in reducing the size limit, and so we have that background. I personally still think that there's some merit to having a trial reduction in the western areas. And so that's still on my mind. Is there any other thoughts here at the commission level? Paul?
Probably just building on comments I made when it came up in the presentation. I think it's not that 32 inches is the right size one way or the other, I suppose, but if one's going to undertake a trial, that implies to me that you're going to undertake an assessment and test it against something. And so that would mean to me that if reduced to 30 inches, that we would have an assessment in fact in place to provide some information to guide us that this was a good decision and that we'd like to carry on with it past 3 years.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think a question for Bruce. In reading from the conference board minutes on page 9, it says, well, reducing the minimum size limit from 32 to 30 inches. And it says, but continue to apportion between areas using current explodable biomass policy. And so I think the explodable biomass, Bruce, the way that I understand it is all fish over 26 inches. So what happens when you reduce the size limit from 30 to 32, or from 32 to 30 inches? Does the explodable biomass remain the same? And then to account for that, I think that you had mentioned earlier that we would need to maybe lower the harvest rate to accomplish this. So a little confused by this language here and what's counted in the explodable biomass. My understanding is anything over 26 inches. So this reduction from 32 to 30 inches doesn't necessarily change that explodable biomass.
Thank you, Commissioner Kaufman. It's a little more involved in that because the current harvest policy was based on 32 inches. So that's kind of the disconnect right now, is that it's working on a 32-inch size limit, whereas now we're talking about using a different size limit. So it would in fact change your perception of that. I would like to correct a comment you made, Mr. Chairman, on this. It isn't that the staff is opposed to a change in size limit. All we're saying is if you want to change the size limit, we think there are some conditions that need to be there for us to be able to evaluate for you whether or not that was a reasonable thing to do, or give you some kind of assessment of it. That's the staff perspective on it.
Thank you. I'm sorry I mischaracterized that. I personally find it difficult to believe that in some areas where perhaps 70% of the fish that are caught on the long line are below, these are caught, they're on the hooks, they're below 32 inches and have to be released into the ocean, released back, and they're probably caught multiple times. We don't have good discard mortality rates on multiply caught and released fish. We know we have problems with whales. To me, it just makes sense to try to figure out how to use some of those fish in that smaller group. I appreciate Commissioner Ryle saying that we actually, perhaps 32 isn't the exact right size. So we have that in the books, and there is a value to not changing things that you don't have to, because it makes analysis harder. But just keeping the size limit at 32, because we've had it that way forever, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If it was at 24, could we not change it? If it was at 44, would we have to stay with that? So just because we've been at 32, it's not like the peak of the production curve any longer. It was perhaps back when fish were growing so that you had a 20-year-old fish weighed 100 pounds. Now they weigh 50 pounds. I doubt that's the right biological size to maximize yield anymore. So I think it's time to look at it, and I spoke for it enough. But any other comments? Okay, thank you. So I believe those are the only industry proposals on the regulate that the conference board talked about. Staff regulatory proposals, retention of tagged halibut. Any discussion? Logbooks, I think these are generally things that we can accomplish along these lines that are recommended. Well, there are more industry regulatory proposals over on 11. Fish tickets in 2A, commercial logbook requirements. Comments on those? Bruce? Where did I skip those? Oh, I did talk about the catch sharing plans a little bit and ask if there was any comments. So that's the first big one from the governments, is how to the catch share plans in 2A and 2C and 3A in particular. And of course there's one in 4C, D, and E, although that's not talked about right here. I can't find it. Thank you. So sablefish pots, fishermen that fish with pots, if a crew member on that boat has a IFQ for halibut, should they be allowed to retain that, or should they be required to retain that? So we have a motion passed by the U.S. side. Is there any discussion of that? So again, I'm personally tipping my hand on the way I feel about those. I don't always win these things, but the way I feel is that this actually should be allowed. Again, it's a better full utilization. I just don't know why, if you're targeting sablefish and you catch a halibut or two, why you would be required to throw those away. I don't think the impacts on the market would be that large, and it would be a conservation-oriented move. So I lean towards allowing that. Jeff.
I don't have anything to add, really. I just want to say that I echo your thoughts on this one, Jim.
Thank you. Bruce.
Just a quick administrative thing. If the commission decides to approve this, right now the way the council motion is set up, it's set up by sablefish management areas. This probably wouldn't be approved till something like October, I think, if it was there for implementation. We would need time for the two staffs of our agencies to work together, if this was approved, to try to harmonize what areas would be involved in and how they would be designated for such a retention. Is that fair enough?
Thank you. I appreciate that. So that's good information. Bob.
So if we made this for all regulatory areas from Dixon Entrance to the Bering Sea, does that ease the burden of figuring out that you may have different regulatory areas for both the U.S. government and IPHC, but on block, they're both the same geographical areas?
Thank you, Commissioner Alverson, but the U.S. regulatory proposal is only for the Gulf of Alaska.
But there's nothing to stop us from suggesting something larger and having it the same throughout all our regulatory areas. Are we restricted to, we would then have a different regulation in the Bering Sea and Aleutians than we have in the Gulf?
No, Mr. Alverson, there doesn't currently exist a regulation for pot retention or proposed for it. That was taken off the table at the council meeting. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, Heather, can you help me on this one? What would that do to us in terms of, if that was a regulation put in terms of 2B? That's sort of the one thing I'm thinking about that. All U.S. areas. U.S. areas anyway. Some thoughts on that, Heather?
Commissioner Alverson, I think the commission could accept pot gear as a legal gear for any regulatory area. The council, though, has recommended for the Gulf of Alaska. So, and I've just looked it up, the Gulf of Alaska, if it includes the Western GOA, goes out towards, I believe, between 4A and 4B. So I don't think there's anything stopping the commission from accepting a gear, because that is the commission. The commissions can do that. Although I think if you were looking at it as an incidental fishery, you would be allowing pot gear for halibut where pot gear is not allowed for sablefish, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought it might be a good idea to clarify from the NIMS perspective in respect to your question, Commissioner Alverson. As you were discussing, the council's action in front of you recommended authorizing sablefish longline pot gear in the Gulf of Alaska. The council did not recommend that same action for the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, and it would be our intent, if you did recommend the action that you suggested, some sort of authorization for all U.S. management areas, it would be our intent to go back to the council and consult with them before taking any additional action, but beyond the Gulf.
Bob?
Is their definition of the Gulf different than ours?
Yes, indeed.
Of course. Maybe sometime between today and tomorrow morning, I'd like to have a clean regulation through all our regulatory areas, and if that's not possible, then I'd like to know what our limitations are coming into tomorrow morning.
If I can, I think what Rachel described is correct, is that there would be a sequential thing, and there certainly would be opportunity for the commission to consider expanding it beyond the Gulf of Alaska area that the council is considering right now. By the time the council got around to doing something different on that, we would have an additional opportunity to expand that should you so desire.
Mr. Chairman, the reason I bring that up because pots are allowed for sablefish in the Bering Sea and the Aleutians. And so if they're going to be made available in the Gulf, I was just trying to tie it all together. So that's my train of thought.
And following on, what would be the downside of the commission legalizing that gear? And the council wouldn't have to do it. And then is there a conflict there? The commission legalizes pots as halibut gear, but the council doesn't allow sablefish pots in the Bering Sea to catch halibut if they didn't want to?
Mr. Chair, I don't...
Probably have to go to the woodshed with Rachel and get straightened out on this, but...
I don't think it's true. There wouldn't be a conflict per se. Just our general policy would be to consult with the council before
So I was trying to, by the way, when I said to the woodshed, she was going to beat me up, not the other way around, because I didn't understand what was going on. But in the vein of Commissioner Elverson's thing, to simplify it, if we just got done with it once, and then the council could pick it up piecewise as they wanted to. But if that causes issues, we can talk about that later. Thanks.
I understand. Thank you.
Anything else? Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I touched on this briefly yesterday, so I'm not sure that I should touch on it again, but if we're going to vote on this tomorrow, it'd be nice to have some clarity about, because there's the overlap between the sablefish areas. For instance, the Central Gulf sablefish areas, I believe, cover parts of areas 3A and parts of area 3B. So if that vessel was fishing for sablefish, for instance, in 3A, in the 3A section of the Central Gulf sablefish area, and retained halibut, could that boat then move into area 3B and retain halibut? I know that's against halibut regulations currently, and that you can't move among regulatory areas without an observer on board. So I think it gets a little bit sticky, but it sure would be nice to know by the time we vote tomorrow what that means, and maybe that's further down the road, and maybe we're approving this conceptually and that the details need to be worked out later, but just looking for some clarity there.
If I can, Mr. Chair, I think you raise an excellent point, Jeff, in terms of how we might deal with that right now. As you point out, fishing across regulatory areas has some certain strictures on how much you can do on that. Part of this would be trying to harmonize the areas that were involved with this, and there's a possibility that you can then redefine a regulation for that gear retention in that area. That's in the realm of the doable, but it would require a regulatory change on our part as well, in addition to the, or it could be as an adjunct to the authorization with pot gear.
So then just to follow up on that, I suppose that if the sablefish vessel was fishing in between areas 3A and 3B, for instance, they would obviously have to have IFQ halibut in both of those regulatory areas. So it gets a little bit complicated.
It does. The way it works right now, correct me if I'm wrong, Heather, it's the stricture would be that you can't have any more on board than the smallest of the area allocations for wherever that license holder has.
Thank you. So there's only a couple more proposals. I think neither the conference board nor the PAG took action on maximum size limit of 60 inches. There is a desire to look at discard mortality rates again. I think we can talk about that and probably support it. And we have a motion for a notion from the Nunivak area for a expanded survey. So, Dr. Ling, do you have any comments on that right now? So we'll be in a shape to discuss that later on.
I do have some comments on it, and it relates to what one can derive from a very restricted survey like that relative to how we're managing the halibut resource. So we're using Area 4C D&E as a single area, and the idea of having something separate for that small of an area is unlikely to provide much precision on this, but I'm going to ask Ian if he would come up and share some thoughts on if that's with your permission, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. I guess I would I begin by going back to one of the slides that Dr. Ray Webster presented, where he presented the patchwork of abundance indices and various surveys that we currently use to estimate the trend and abundance in the Bering Sea. One of his last figures was a bar chart showing the relative contributions from each of those, and I think this is what Bruce was getting at, which is that our overall goal is to provide a relatively precise index across the entire coastwide stock. And when we look at Area 4C D&E in particular, what we see there is that by and large the Area 4S, the broad area covered by the Bering Sea Trawl Survey, is currently these days making the largest contribution to that estimate. If we were to make a small cutout in the area around Nunivak Island and do a separate survey there, it would still likely have a very small contribution to that overall Area 4C D&E total. Obviously, we can't know for sure what that contribution would be until we did such a survey. But overall, in terms of optimizing our effort and return on our survey to the precision of the estimate, we need to I think we need to focus on the broad areas that will give us better precision on a broad scale across the regulatory areas. Now that said, the Commission, as Bruce mentioned, we treat Area 4C D&E as a single biomass unit. And the reason we do that is because our current understanding of the dynamics up there is that those fish are relatively mobile. There is movement from the flats to the islands, from the islands back to the flats, out to the edge, and north along the coast. Obviously, we don't know exactly what that movement looks like, but our tagging suggests that those areas are well connected. And so we don't currently see a reason to draw a biological boundary in there somewhere. If we had reason to believe there was a biological boundary, it would make much more sense for us to survey a particular small area. So that's the rationale, I think, that the Commission has been using to try and prioritize our survey efforts. The catch sharing plan that's in place is the domain of the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, and there those limits that are sublimits within the Area 4C D&E are not something that we support biologically.
Any questions of Ian on that? No, thank you very much. Appreciate it. So I think that brings us through our discussion of the proposals and catch limits. Any last comments on that before we have lunch break? Paul?
Yeah, this is, we're about to break, Jim?
Yes.
Okay. So I was going to ask the Canadian delegation to meet once we break in the Egan room. So we'll get together now rather than later in the afternoon, so immediately following when we adjourn.
Okay, so thank everyone for this morning. This era of transparency and the Halibut Commission stuff is still gaining, and so we probably were too transparent here. You can find out I don't know what I'm talking about most of the time. In other previous years, we could have done that behind closed doors, but we appreciate everyone being in here and the attention that we have and the support from the advisory bodies. So thanks very much. I think we'll start again here at 1:30. Working through a number of these issues. Thanks. I'm thinking we'll probably be done here in an hour or something like that, but we will have the session, and we'll see where we get to. Then we'll adjourn, and then, of course, there will be individual and private machinations of the brain as we come to our positions on those quotas. So let's go through that. Once again, anything new on any of the catch quotas that has occurred to a commissioner while they were having lunch or discussions with their delegation? I see no new ideas. So without going through the proposals one by one, I think something that we had talked a little bit about getting some information on from Dr. Stewart was the 30-inch size limit thing, and so perhaps I'll ask Ian if he's got anything that might be useful for our consideration before we decide what to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I spent a little time this morning going back through the notes from last year's presentation, and I have that presentation on our system over there in case we want to go back to anything in particular. As you all know, the staff hasn't done any additional analysis from the work that we did between the interim meeting and the annual meeting of last year's process. If it pleases you, the commissioners, I would be happy to summarize that work maybe a lot more briefly than we did last year and just give you some of the salient points that we identified from that last year.
Please do that.
Okay. I thought it would be helpful to look at this in terms of potential pros and cons of a change in size limit, and additionally a few considerations that might be relevant to that. So I'll try to divide this up into just those three categories. I would say beforehand, reiterating what Bruce said, is that the staff don't have an opinion on a change in size limit. My intention is to provide you with some scientific information about the pros and cons, but we don't have a position on this. It really is a policy decision, and there is a sustainable harvest policy associated with any potential size limit that the Commission might consider. I think that the goal of potentially changing the size limit, as I understood it last year, was to reduce wastage. So the focus of the pros and cons as I'll present them are with regard to that question and other considerations. If there's something else you'd like me to comment on, I'd be happy to. I'll start with the pro or the positive side of the ledger. We estimated last year that if the size limit were reduced from 32 to 30 inches, there would be an increase in CPUE, particularly in those areas that are currently encountering a high proportion of sublegal fish. We estimated that this change in CPUE could be as high as 20 or 25%. And so that not only means increased efficiency, but it also means less effort would have to be required to obtain the same amount of quota. So catch rates could be as high, excuse me, as 20 or 25% higher than they are now in certain regulatory areas, primarily in areas 3B would be the top change, and also in area 3. But there would be an increase in other areas as well. A second potential benefit of change in minimum size limit would be more males in the catch. We did identify, using the survey as a proxy for what we think the fishery would encounter, we did identify that there was a greater percentage of males in the catch at 31 and 30 inches than females. And so the overall, the sex ratio would tend to change to include slightly more males than females as you went down in minimum size limit. However, I think relative to expectations, there may not be as many males waiting just below the minimum size limit as people might think. When we actually, and there's a series of figures in last year's RARA, I'm sorry I don't have the page number reference, but I could get that for you. There were a series of figures produced for last year's RARA showing the actual percentages of males and females at each of those 1-inch increments from 32 all the way down. I think we went as low as 28. And although there are more males in that range, it's not as overwhelming as I think we, the analysts, expected before we actually looked at the data. In addition, a third potential benefit would be that we would learn the price of these fish. And as you'll see in a second here, the price that would be paid for these fish less than 32 inches particularly the differential between the price for those fish and the price for larger fish, could be an important component generating a change or no change in the incentives to target these fish or not. The fourth potential benefit is that there may actually be a slightly more yield available to the fishery because of the current low size at age. Some of the analyses that Dr. Martel presented last year suggested that given current size at age, there might be a slight increase in the amount of yield available because these fish are closer to the peak of the yield per recruit relationship. On the negative side of the ledger would be a greater risk of recruitment overfishing. In some fisheries are managed in such a way that there is a minimum size limit that's used to make sure that fish are going to reach maturity and spawn, in some cases at least once, before they've been harvested. Any reduction in the minimum size limit brings us closer to a point where we can no longer ensure spawning prior to harvest. And in fact, imagine a 10-inch minimum size limit. There would certainly be a lot of exploitation going on before the fish were anywhere near reproductive age. What this means is there's less margin for error. If we get the F wrong, if we get the catches wrong, we think one level is sustainable and it turns out to be the wrong level, our estimate of the stock size is incorrect, we have less margin for error because those fish are being caught before they've had a chance to reach maturity. So I think this begs the question then, now back to the original, which is how is this likely to affect the overall wastage? It makes intuitive sense that if we're catching fish now and those fish are just retained and there's no other change, then we've eliminated some of that wastage. As you remember from last year, the question really is, is it possible, and then secondarily, is it likely or not that selectivity could shift toward even smaller fish, and we may end up with the same amount of wastage, but instead of that wastage being primarily 29 to 31-inch fish, now it's 26 to 29-inch fish. And there are a couple considerations that we outlined in the presentation last year about why selectivity might change. One of which, a couple considerations about why it might change. One would be the catch rate. So assuming that something like a 20 or 25% catch rate improvement could be achieved, there is a potential for people to target those areas where their catch rate would be increased. One way to think about this, I believe that we used an example of hook size last year, but I don't think that was the best example to use. I think a spatial or temporal example would be a better one. Imagine somebody is in a patch of small fish and they're shaking most of those fish as sublegal. Currently, it's in their best interest to move to another area because that's not an efficient operation. Under a smaller size limit, they may be able to achieve a catch rate that's reasonable to stay in that area and therefore actually start to encounter additional fish that are even below a new minimum size limit, below 30 inches. That would be the consideration there. This is clearly going to depend on the interaction between catch rate and the price that's being paid for those fish. And we don't know exactly on either of those counts how that would turn out. So I just present that as the consideration, the pro and the con there. We did clearly identify that depending on changes in selectivity, this could be a net positive effect on the stock or a net negative effect, or sorry, not on the stock, on the amount of wastage that would occur. With a big enough shift in selectivity, we could end up with just as much wastage with a smaller minimum size. Of course, we don't know how much selectivity might change. I think the largest concern, and I'm almost done, thanks for your time this afternoon. I think one of the largest concerns we had last year is moving forward. It's not whether this is a good idea or a bad idea, it's how we would then evaluate it after the fact. And Steve was giving the presentation, but we were both in agreement that our worst case scenario would be coming back next year or 3 years from now and having you ask us, is it working? And we would not have any way to tell you whether it was working because the current monitoring at sea is not providing us with enough information to look at the rate of these sublegals directly in the fishery, nor the size distribution of those sublegals. The only other considerations that I noted here from last year's notes are, one, that changing the size structure of the commercial catch would have an effect, a potential effect on the spatial distribution of biomass. So if we're harvesting more fish at a younger age or a smaller size, that will have an effect on the way the spatial distribution of the remaining biomass. Presumably these fish would be harvested, if you will, farther upstream in their movement throughout their lifetime. Obviously, I would love to be able to quantify that a little better, but that's in a general sense, I think you can imagine how that would go. Last comment, it occurs to me, I'd be seeing the proposal only for the western areas, and I agree that those are the areas where this would probably have the largest effect. It also occurs to me that in Area 2B, with camera coverage and logbook records of sublegal encounter rates, 2B would be the only area that we would actually have some information to detect a response to this. It would not be information about the size structure of the sublegal catches, but at least we would have the piece counts associated with that. We already use those piece counts from the 2B logbooks to estimate the wastage on an annual basis, and so we could at least see what the response in that particular area is to this if it were applied in that area as well as other areas under consideration.
Thank you very much. Any questions, David?
Ian, is there any possibility that splitting the fleet, saying to vessels that were willing to take EM or an observer in those areas, you can take fish down to 30 inches, but if you don't have at sea monitoring of some kind, it'll stay at 32, and then watching to see where the boats went and what they did? Is that some kind of an experiment that might be informative, and it might be a way of easing into this new size limit? Just don't know.
I guess I would need to think through the implications of that a little bit. At first blush, I think it would be fairly complicated for us to keep track of that information in the greater scope. We would now need to stratify all of our estimates of wastage mortality by not only by area but by the coverage, by the type of observation that was on that vessel. And I think that could prove a pretty significant technical challenge.
Bruce.
Ian, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the likely impacts on the assessment, given the fact that we would then be visiting mortality on a component of the stock that's moving more than the sort of larger component we have there, and the fact that this would be only restricted to some portion of the stock area, and then probably that portion of the stock area where we have the most movement coming from.
Yes, thanks, Bruce. That would certainly complicate our analysis of selectivity and our understanding of the dynamics of the stock. It's not clear exactly how we would deal with that in the stock assessment model. There would certainly be a change associated with that in the relative selectivity of the fleet. One point I just noticed in my notes here that I failed to mention in the initial section here was the question that came up last year, which was that if the catch limits remained at the current harvest policy, but there was a 30-inch minimum size limit used, would that be a conservative approach? We had considerable discussion about that last year. I think, Mr. Chairman, I think it was your question about whether or not that would be a conservative approach, recognizing that overall, if we start to exploit fish at a smaller age, we know that we would need a lower level of fishing intensity on the stock to account for that. And I think that in our presentation last year, we left that open as a good question, to quote Steve last year, because again, it's not entirely obvious where the current peak yield per recruit would be. Generally, moving to harvesting smaller fish would require a slightly lower harvest rate. And this is essentially the discussion around the fishery footprint. In effect, we would be changing the directed fisheries footprint by steering more of that mortality towards slightly smaller fish, and therefore converting that directly into pounds, it's not entirely intuitive exactly what the effect on the stock would be in that case.
Well, I was hoping that at the very least it would turn from a good question into a great question now that you're on it. So, any other questions or comments on this? I'm sorry, online, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's one question online from Henry Mitchell who asks, is there an upstream distribution of halibut migration?
I'm not sure exactly where that question's going, but I guess I'll summarize what we think we understand about.
It came in during the part where either you or Dr. Lehman talked about hitting the more mobile part of the stock as it was moving.
Okay. There certainly is there is movement in all directions by halibut. We have tagged and recovered halibut moving both east and west, north and south. All of these areas remain connected. The dominant movement patterns, however, are generally to the east and to the south. And we have seen from juvenile tagging that those rates appear to be substantially higher for young halibut, say 2 to about 5 or 6 years old, than they are for older halibut. Frankly, life was a lot simpler when we thought older halibut didn't move at all. Now that we know from the pit tagging study that they do, we see that the rates that we've estimated, and there's actually a figure in your RARA this year in the data section showing you our best working hypothesis about the movement rates among areas by age. It's a 4-panel figure in your RARA this year. And that figure represents a composite of a reanalysis that Dr. Ray Webster's done of our pit tagging information for adult halibut, as well as an aggregation of information from all of the previous tagging studies, including younger halibut in the Gulf, the sparse information we have from Area 4B and Area 4, all put in that one picture. But generally, there is a bit of upstream movement, but most of it is generally downstream across the stock.
Thank you. So it seems to me that one of the cons, as you've laid out there, is we may not gain any information on this because we don't have 100% coverage. So I'm kind of at a loss to understand why a statistical sample of 25% doesn't provide some information. I understand there could be some biases because fishermen might act differently with an observer on board, but you know, it's only in pretty recent times, and Canada might be an exception to that. So congratulations, and it's a good system. But it's only in very recent times we have any observers at all, and we've been managing fisheries for hundreds of years. So the idea that we can't do anything without 100% observer coverage kind of befuddles me a little bit. 25% is a pretty good coverage, and particularly if you have the ability to have some electronic monitoring in some other boats, it seems to me that you must be able to learn something from that.
Yes, thank you for the question. I would agree that there is some information available there. I'm not sure whether 25% is the current rate on number of vessels or trips. The last numbers I saw were more like 6 to 7% of the landings were covered. The bigger concern that I would have, not so much the extrapolation of that rate to the fleet that's covered. Based on some CPUE analysis that I worked on over the last couple of years, what we found was that the vessels that are under 40 feet tend to be fishing different gear. They tend to be much more prevalent using snap gear, and they tend to be fishing in different spatial areas, farther inshore, and potentially accessing a different part of the halibut population. So although we would be getting some information, I'm relatively uncomfortable extrapolating the observer coverage, even if it was 25% of the 40 to 57.5 foot vessels. That may not be representative of our entire halibut fleet. I think around half of the total halibut effort occurs on those smaller vessels, that fishery has some different properties than the larger vessels. But that said, you're correct. We would get some information from that. the current observer program.
Thank you. I don't need to press that point. And I didn't mean to indicate that I think there's 25% of the trips covered. It was just relative to the statement that we have to have 100% monitoring. Surely we can learn something with some other level is what I mean. So thank you. Any further comments? Thank you, Ian. That's helpful. Does it occur to any other commissioner that we have incomplete discussion of any of the regulatory proposals? Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I should have touched on this earlier and I failed to do it. But anyway, it's regarding the Nunavak survey motion. And so I'm not sure that when we spoke about this earlier that we had a clear understanding of maybe the concerns of the people in 4E and around Nunavak and some of the gentlemen that I was able to speak to from Koyuk about their intentions and their desire to get further surveys around Nunavak Island. And so together we looked at the survey maps and they could see clearly that there was pretty decent coverage around the Pribilof Islands and that there was some sparse coverage along the edge, but that there was very little survey data, particularly set line survey data inside the 4E region. So what these gentlemen that I spoke to were intending to do was to get a better handle on maybe the local abundance of halibut around that particular island. It's a very large island when we compared it to St. Matthew Island, for instance. That Nunavak is quite large, and they think that there may be a decent body of fish in there. And their intention, I think, maybe doesn't lie within the decision-making ability of this body, but what they're hoping to do is get a better idea of what's there, and then I think maybe take that over to the council, and what they wanted to do is carve out a piece of that 4E area for their communities that fall within range of that island in their little boats, and they're fishing very small boats, but they feel like they get a very small piece of the pie around that island, and I think they'd like to go to the council and see if they could carve out a piece of 4E, I guess, so that they can have, because they're dependent on that fishery. And so anyway, they felt that maybe the best thing they could do is get increased survey coverage around that island for a couple of years, and they were asking how they might be able to do that, and so I told them to go to the conference board. So I feel some responsibility to bring it up here. And so I don't think, obviously we look at it as one, I don't think they were trying to change what the abundance of the Bering Sea might look like, for instance, and we look at 4CD&E as one single region. I don't think they were trying to change what the abundance of the whole area might look like, in understanding that we manage that as one stock of fish, but rather wanting that information so they could take it to the North Pacific Council and potentially do something there that we could lock in a piece of that fishery. So just wanted to clarify.
So on that point, Jeff, is, maybe you know this, or maybe Ian or one of the stock guys does the NIMS trawl survey, which is what we use to characterize much of the Bering Sea on an annual basis, does the NIMS trawl survey cover that area? We may not have that information, but I think you're correct that this would need to go to the council.
Mr. Chair, maybe I could have Ian talk about that. I know that they do have inshore stations there, but there's some, I think, significant edge there.
They do. There are several inshore stations around Nunavak, but they are similar to our set line survey. They're quite sparse. We're talking about just a handful of stations around the island, and you know, frankly, for an area of that size, even being a relatively large island, we just have a handful of stations in that area. They wouldn't be sufficient to estimate the local abundance of halibut in that area, given our current design, which is, you know, that's not the intent of our current design. At a 10-mile grid, it's just not suitable for that.
So just, these are halibut users, so just in a helpful context, is there anything that occurs to you that we might be able to look at to show what the distribution around there might be? So maybe they deserve a, I mean, if it's not the trawl survey, is there something else, or are we out of luck?
I actually had a brief conversation with the gentleman during the break here, and I think one of the things that we could look at right away, and I mentioned to them, would be if they could submit some logbooks. We get very few logbooks from Area 4E, And it would be, I think it would be quite helpful if even though they're not required, if they're on small vessels, they're not required to submit those logs, we would be happy to receive that information. And we could use that to compare catch rates in that area, perhaps to catch rates around the Pribilof Islands. And that would provide us with a pretty quick way to do some comparison among those areas right sooner rather than later. Perhaps even using that in the future to think about more about survey design.
Could I just elaborate on that a little bit? As you recall from last year's meetings, you gave some instruction to staff to sort of do some outreach with this, which we did, and we have done previously as well in terms of having our staff meet with users in those areas and distributing logbooks. But we still may get very, very few logbooks back from the area. But I think Ian's point is absolutely correct. Having those logbooks would allow us to give some sort of parity comparisons between other areas where we have logbooks.
Yeah, so just as a follow-up, and I think it's applicable and worthy of note that maybe some of the commissioners don't know too, is that there's through the catch sharing plan in areas 4C, D, and E, obviously all of those areas have suffered major declines of to the tune of 65% since 2011. But there's a threshold in that catch sharing plan, and Bruce or maybe Ian can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that threshold is 1.63 million pounds. When the quota falls below 1.63 million pounds, well, let me reverse that. When the quota in 4C/D&E is above 1.63 million pounds, Area 4E gets the first 80,000 off the top, and then a percentage from there after the 80 is taken off the top. So when it falls below 1.63 million pounds, they lose in 4E that first 80,000 pounds off the top, but they continue to get their percentage, which I think is 7.5% or something like that. So with the bycatch adjustments that were made, the new blue line number came out at 1.64 million, which does get the 4E fishermen that first 80,000 off the top. And so they should see a pretty significant bump, more so than the percentage increase from 1.285 to 1.64 million, because they get the first 80 this year, whereas for the last few years they didn't get that. So that should be very helpful to those fishermen in 4E. And I believe that the gentlemen that are here from 4E are in the Coastal Villages CDQ region, and I think that CDQ group gets 70% of 4E, if I'm correct. So just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Ian, for the logbook idea. That actually had not occurred to me, so that's very useful. I appreciate it. Ted, please.
Mr. Chair, I spoke with a gentleman who put forward this question, and I got the impression that the sites they were talking about were north of the island and not anywhere near the existing set stations. The places that they were giving up as places to start were, my understanding, the places where they found the most abundances of fish in their experience around their homeland there. So that was pretty interesting to me. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you. And perhaps logbook information there might be very revealing if there's no effort up there at all, survey effort at all. Any other regulatory proposals? Paul, please.
Yeah, I had two, just going back to the size limit one, and I was wondering if the question was posed to the staff about, well, what would a monitoring system look like? And maybe it's some options of what a monitoring system could look like to address the impact of changing from 32 to 30, and providing some options to us as commissioners to say, here's one that would help address, but maybe it's not 100% monitoring. I don't know. But so maybe there's some room there to figure out some options, Jim, that would help. That'd be a question for, I guess, Ian or Bruce to see if that was what could be done.
Thank you. That occurred to me too, obviously sending it back. But then it also occurs, you're looking, it's been like on the agenda for 6 years in a row. I kind of hate to go a seventh year. We've had this on the agenda longer than the upswing in CPUE and 2B, and we can't get past start on it. So, but nonetheless, that may be the way to go, and I appreciate the thought. And yes, but please.
Yes, The other one I was going to raise was just going back to there were questions about sablefish and halibut retention and whether further discussion had ensued and sorted out how that might happen.
Thank you. We've had discussions, but I'm reluctant personally to relate how that came out. So maybe I could have one of our reg people come up there and explain where we got it. Heather Gilroy, perhaps. My idea was not good, it turned out.
You got the short straw, did you?
I see that Rachel's still on her conference call. Oh, is she there?
I didn't have these discussions.
Oh, yeah. We've had further discussions. I don't think we've resolved it. We have looked now at the sablefish area versus the halibut areas. And I would make one point. The commission, if they chose to allow legal halibut retention and sablefish pots and tie it to the sablefish regulation, we've done that in the past, where instead of allowing the legal gill right at the beginning of the area, we would tie it to the federal rule. So when the federal rule goes in place in October or November, that's when the retention of halibut could happen with the sablefish pots. I don't know if we've resolved the different areas yet, but if we did tie it to the sablefish, we could tie it to the I mean, your choice is tying it to the sablefish areas or tying it to an IPHC area, essentially.
So perhaps if we took this action and made the sablefish pot a legal gear consistent with the area that the council wanted to work on, we'd have till October to figure out how to work on those areas since the reg's trailing, or do we have to understand how it works right now?
Mr. Chairman, I think it would be helpful if we sorted that out by the time the proposed rule was published for the council's action, but it would give us, to give the public a chance to comment on the impacts. That would be the ideal situation. But I think we would have a little bit of time then to sort out the area issue.
Just as a review, what is the current rule in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Island for sablefish pots and halibut?
In the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, pots are legal gear in the sablefish IFQ fishery, and any halibut that are incidentally caught in those pots must be discarded.
Well, they must be discarded. And we couldn't tie a proposal to an existing federal reg out there to allow retention? We don't need an answer immediately, but that's kind of where I'd like to go if it's possible. But if it's not, if it's too far to reach, then we should know that by tomorrow morning.
I believe the commission can define legal gear, so the commission could allow halibut retention in sablefish pots in the Aleutian Island and Bering Sea. I don't know if you had your advisory, I don't believe your advisory boards have discussed that. So I don't know if you've got an opinion from your advisory boards on the gear outside of the Gulf of Alaska.
And in addition to that, we don't know what the North Pacific Council thinks about that outside the Gulf of Alaska. Is that correct? Because the council's current action is only the Gulf.
That is correct.
And so this may be something that the joint committee ought to look at so that the council and the commission could be on the same page relative to whether that both groups are interested in allowing halibut caught in sablefish pots in the sablefish fishery to be retained instead of discarded.
Yeah, it just seems I haven't gotten specific advice from the advisory panel, but it just seems like a natural step. So
Bruce?
Just a question for Heather and Rachel. Right now, at least my understanding of the regulatory authority of the commission is that it would extend to what we have defined in regulations, which would be regulatory areas. And I don't believe our statistical areas are defined in regulation, Heather, are they?
That's correct, just regular.
That's great. So we only have, right now, our regulatory authority and capability is restricted to regulatory areas. So in order to make that different, we would have to have a regulation change to define those areas. So I'm a bit concerned about if we sort of kick this down the road to October, that at some point in between there, we as a commission will have to have a regulation passed that might redefine some areas for this. Is that correct?
I agree with Bruce. As Rachel was speaking, we would want to know direction from the commission, whether you would want to tie legal gear to the sablefish fishery management areas or the IPHC management areas.
Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I should know the answer to this, and I served on the IFQ implementation committee, which is part of the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council for some time now, and I remember that there was a proposal submitted that would allow retention of halibut and sablefish pots in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, and that there has been a pot sablefish fishery in the Bering Sea for a few years now, and I thought that was working its way through the council process, and but Rachel may know better than me. I don't know if that got stopped somewhere or if that, maybe it did.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm looking over at Sam in case I might need a little bit of help from him. There was a specific proposal back and forth. You're not talking about the 4A proposal. Are you talking about the entire Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands? Because that one I'm not familiar with.
In hindsight, I think you're right. It was 4A.
The 4A proposal.
You're right.
And I think Sam covered, I'm happy to remind you what happened with that, but Sam did discuss that, I believe, yesterday in his report. And the last time the council reviewed that proposal, there was basically not many participants that were interested in pursuing that at that time, so the council did not take any further action.
Thanks for the clarification. I forgot. Somehow I thought that was Bering Sea, Aleutian Island, but I think it was restricted to 4A.
Bob?
So from a fisherman's point of view, he's got a few halibut and he catches them in the pots. And is he going to be in violation of some sort if he was issued that he has 3A halibut and it lenses over into a different area, NIMS area? Maybe I don't want to go down this road.
I don't know. I don't think it's a different issue for pots versus longline gear. So if the person's fishing sablefish with longline gear, then the sablefish and halibut areas are not the same. So I don't think adding pot gear to that makes a difference. Could I also make another comment on Jeff's question? The commission did agree to allowing the retention of halibut and pot gear in the overlap of the Bering Sea with Area 4A with an MRA, or MRI, yeah, maximum allowable amount. So you'd already agreed to that and it went back to the council, but then it came off the council's table.
Clear on that. Any other regulatory proposals we should beat around the table? I'm going to have yet another session on this last one to know exactly where we are, but there's no point in belaboring the public's time on that, I think. So anything you, Keith?
I only had one more comment came in online at the end of the discussion about Area 4E and Nunivak, and it's from Henry Mitchell, who asks me to please inform the commissioners that 4E halibut fishery did not occur last season.
Thank you. I think we had that information in the opening session, but I appreciate that emphasized. Dr. Lehman, is there something else that you know of that we have not struggled through?
I don't believe so, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I think we did advertise that there would be public comments at the end of this session, so is there anyone in the public that would like to make a statement? I see no one, so with that, we will adjourn for the day. We have a lot of thinking to do. This is the hard part for us, of course, and we're looking forward to it. So we will, what's the time for tomorrow morning? The public session tomorrow is 9 o'clock, and I'd remind you that the Young Fishermen's Forum has invited everyone to a reception tonight at the Twisted Fish, I believe at 6:30. That's a little restaurant down just past where the gondola goes up to Mount Roberts. So thanks very much.